History's official record fractures under unsettling anomalies no textbook can comfortably explain. Entire chapters contradict themselves, as if rewritten by unseen hands. Eyewitness reports collide with impossible dates, leaving scholars unsettled and defensive. Something buried beneath accepted timelines refuses correction, hinting at revelations that would overturn everything we believe settled. Stretching across what is now the frozen boundary between Siberia and Alaska lies a vast, silent expanse, Beringia. Today, it is mostly imagined as a submerged land bridge beneath the Bering Strait. But during the last ice age, it was not a bridge at all. It was a world, a cold, wind-swept steppe stretching farther than the eye could see, populated by hardy grasses, roaming herds of megafauna, and the first human groups adapting to one of the most extreme environments on Earth. This was not a frozen wasteland in the way we often picture ancient ice ages. During warmer phases of the Pleistocene, Beringia formed what researchers call a refugium, a relatively ice-free zone where life persisted even as glaciers locked away much of the northern hemisphere. Here, between roughly 30,000 and 10,000 BC, human groups are believed to have lived, hunted, and slowly adapted to shifting climates. Archaeological and genetic studies suggest that these populations were not simply passing through. Instead, they may have remained isolated in Beringia for thousands of years, in what is sometimes referred to as the Beringian standstill. A pause in migration, a long silence in human movement, where small groups survived in relative isolation before dispersing into the Americas. But what did life actually look like in this lost land? There are no cities, no monumental ruins rising from the permafrost, at least none that have been confirmed. What remains are subtle traces, stone tools, genetic markers in modern indigenous populations, and scattered archaeological sites on both sides of the Bering Strait. These fragments suggest highly adaptive hunter-gatherer societies, capable of tracking mammoth, bison, and caribou across open plains. They likely lived in mobile dwellings, following the rhythms of animal migration and seasonal change. Yet Beringia itself raises questions that science can only partially answer. If humans lived there for thousands of years, why is so little physical evidence preserved? Is it simply the destructive force of glaciation, sea level rise, and permafrost decay? Or is there something about this region, its shifting landscapes, its post-glacial flooding, that erased nearly everything? Some researchers point to the dramatic end of Beringia around 11,000 BC, when rising seas submerged the land bridge and transformed the region into the Bering Strait we know today. Entire ecosystems vanished beneath the water. Any settlements along coastal zones would have been swallowed, their remains scattered or sealed under sediment. In this view, the absence of evidence is not mystery, but geography and time working together. Still, alternative interpretations occasionally surface at the edges of academic discussion. Some suggest that early populations may have been more complex than typically described, perhaps possessing advanced ecological knowledge systems or seasonal settlement networks that left minimal archaeological footprint. Others speculate about lost coastal migration routes, now submerged, that could rewrite our understanding of how humans first entered the Americas. These ideas remain unproven, but they reflect a growing awareness. Much of Beringia is still underwater, inaccessible, and largely unexplored. Even the genetic record adds another layer of intrigue. Studies of ancient DNA indicate prolonged isolation, yet also hints of later mixing and dispersal events. It suggests a population that was not static, but dynamic, responding, adapting, and eventually moving outward into new worlds as ice sheets retreated. And so Beringia remains both a corridor and a question mark. A place where human history may have paused, transformed, and then slipped quietly beneath rising seas. No written records survive, No voices remain to describe what was seen beneath its endless skies of Ice Age light. What then still lies hidden beneath the waters of the Bering Strait, or locked deep within Arctic permafrost? And how much of our earliest story has been reshaped simply by what the Earth chose to preserve or erase? Beneath the modern Arctic waters that now divide Siberia and Alaska, the landscape of ancient Beringia does not simply end. It disappears in stages. First into marshes, then into fragmented islands, and finally into a submerged silence. Yet some researchers believe that this transition was not abrupt everywhere. Instead, it may have unfolded unevenly, leaving pockets of habitable ground long after the last Ice Age glaciers began to retreat. Imagine standing on that shifting terrain around 12,000 BC. The air is still cold, but no longer glacial in the strictest sense. Meltwater channels cut through the steppe. Seasonal rivers swell and recede. Herds move in predictable cycles, and human groups follow them with equal precision. This was a world in motion, not a static frozen edge, but one constantly reshaped by climate. And yet, something curious persists in the scientific narrative. A scarcity of physical settlement evidence across much of Beringia's exposed shelf. We know humans were present. Genetic studies strongly support it. Stone tools have been recovered on the margins. But the central question remains: where are the long-term camps, the layered occupation sites, the durable traces of extended human presence? One explanation is preservation bias. Much of ancient Beringia now lies beneath the Bering and Chukchi seas, submerged as sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age. Coastal settlements, often among the most resource-rich and densely occupied areas, would have been the first to vanish. What remains on land today may represent only the fringes of a much larger, now inaccessible habitation zone. There is also the possibility that Beringian populations lived in ways that left fewer permanent marks. Highly mobile groups, relying on temporary shelters constructed from organic materials, would leave minimal archaeological signatures. Bone, wood, and hide structures rarely survive millennia of exposure. Could entire lifeways have dissolved without leaving a clear stratigraphic record? Still, this explanation does not fully settle the matter for some researchers. Submerged landscapes elsewhere in the world, such as the prehistoric regions beneath the North Sea, have revealed structured environments, hunting grounds, and even traces of human activity preserved under sediment. This raises an unsettling question. If similar landscapes once existed in Beringia, how much remains undiscovered beneath layers of Arctic silt and cold ocean currents? Offshore geological surveys have begun to map parts of this drowned world. They reveal ancient riverbeds, lake basins, and coastal terraces now hidden beneath water. These are not empty spaces. They are former living environments. But exploration is difficult, slow, and technologically demanding. The Arctic does not easily surrender its past. Beyond mainstream archaeology, more speculative ideas occasionally surface. Some propose that Beringia may have supported more complex social networks than currently assumed. Seasonal gathering points where dispersed groups exchanged knowledge, tools, and genetic lineage. Others suggest that as the climate shifted rapidly, human populations may have reorganized in ways that do not fit traditional models of settlement, leaving behind patterns that are difficult to interpret through conventional excavation alone. There are even fringe interpretations that imagine lost migratory knowledge systems, oral maps encoded in memory, guiding movement across vast and changing Ice Age terrains. While these ideas remain outside established evidence, they reflect a broader truth. Our understanding of prehistoric human behavior is still incomplete, shaped as much by absence as by discovery. And so Beringia remains elusive, not because it was empty, but because it was transformed. A landscape once central to human survival now lies fragmented beneath ocean and ice, its story partially erased by rising seas and shifting climates. What still waits beneath those waters? Are we looking at a complete record of human endurance, or only the fragments that time allowed us to see? From the submerged plains of Beringia, where ancient steppe now lies folded beneath Arctic waters, the story of lost landscapes does not end. It deepens. Because Beringia is not the only place where the earth appears to have withdrawn its past beneath the sea. Across vast distances, in warmer waters and slower currents, another name has echoed through scientific debate, philosophical speculation, and fringe mythology alike. Lemuria. To imagine Lemuria is to look into the Indian Ocean, not at its surface, but far beneath it, where the ocean floor stretches like a silent, fractured memory of continents that once were. Between Madagascar and India, between Sri Lanka and the scattered island chains of Southeast Asia, lies a submerged geology that tells a very real story of drifting land masses, ancient separations, and deep time. But layered over that scientific reality is a far more uncertain narrative, one that asks whether something more than plate tectonics once occupied this space. The concept of Lemuria first emerged in the 19th century, when zoologists studying the curious distribution of lemurs noticed something puzzling. These primates existed in Madagascar and parts of South Asia, yet were absent from mainland Africa in between. In 1864, the English zoologist Philip Sclater proposed a hypothetical lost land beneath the Indian Ocean to explain this biological gap. He named it Lemuria. At the time, it was a scientific solution to a biological mystery, not a myth of lost civilizations. But science was changing rapidly. Within decades, the theory of plate tectonics would provide a far more comprehensive explanation. Continents drift, oceans open, and species distribution is shaped by deep geological time rather than vanished bridges of land. Madagascar, for instance, had already split from the Indian subcontinent tens of millions of years earlier, carrying its isolated ecosystems into evolutionary separation long before humans ever existed. And yet, Lemuria did not disappear. Instead, it migrated. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea was absorbed into esoteric philosophy, most notably theosophy, where Lemuria transformed from a zoological hypothesis into a sprawling myth of an ancient, spiritually advanced civilization. In this reinterpretation, Lemuria was no longer just land. It was a lost world of early humanity, sometimes described as existing before recorded history, before even the civilizations we recognize as ancient. It was said to have been inhabited by beings whose development followed paths very different from our own understanding of human evolution. No archaeological evidence supports such claims. None has ever been found beneath the Indian Ocean, nor on the surrounding landmasses in any form that would suggest a unified, submerged civilization. The ocean floor itself, mapped extensively through modern sonar and satellite technology, reveals mid-ocean ridges, volcanic plateaus, and fracture zones consistent with known geological processes, not the ruins of a sunken continent. But absence of evidence does not always end a story. Sometimes it redirects it. Because beneath the scientific consensus lies a deeper fascination, the human tendency to imagine lost worlds where gaps in knowledge appear. Before continental drift was understood, land bridges were a common explanation for biological distribution. Before deep-sea exploration, entire continents could be imagined in the unknown blue of ocean maps. And even now, despite advanced geology, the vastness of the ocean floor remains only partially explored at high resolution. The Indian Ocean basin itself is a place of immense geological drama. It carries the traces of Gondwana, the supercontinent that once united Africa, Antarctica, India, Australia, and South America before it fragmented over millions of years. India itself drifted northward, colliding with Asia and raising the Himalayas in one of the most powerful tectonic events in Earth's history. In this sense, the region associated with Lemuria is not empty. It is the scar of planetary transformation. Still, speculative interpretations persist at the edges of archaeology and mythology. Some propose that ancient oral traditions from coastal cultures may preserve distant memories of rising seas and disappearing lands, encoded in symbolic stories rather than literal geography. Others suggest that submerged archaeological sites may yet be discovered on continental shelves, reshaping our understanding of early coastal migration routes. While such ideas remain unverified, they reflect an enduring curiosity about what might lie hidden beneath the ocean's surface. There are also broader philosophical interpretations of Lemuria, not as a physical continent, but as a symbolic memory of loss. In this view, Lemuria represents the idea that human history may always be partially submerged, shaped as much by what has been erased as by what has survived. Entire landscapes, ecosystems, and possibly early human coastal settlements could have been lost to post-Ice Age sea level rise, leaving behind only fragments of narrative and scattered archaeological hints. Modern marine archaeology continues to push into these submerged frontiers. Coastal shelf mapping has revealed prehistoric river systems, ancient shorelines, and environments that would have been habitable during lower sea levels. Yet connecting these traces into a coherent picture of early human presence remains an ongoing challenge. The deeper the ocean, the harder the story becomes to reconstruct. And so Lemuria remains suspended between disciplines, part geological misunderstanding, part historical curiosity, part mythological canvas. It is not a confirmed lost continent, nor can it simply be dismissed as a meaningless invention. Instead, it exists as a layered idea, shaped by science, reshaped by imagination, and continually reinterpreted as new knowledge emerges. What makes Lemuria persist, even after its scientific foundations have been replaced, is perhaps not evidence, but possibility. The possibility that beneath miles of water and millions of years of tectonic change, there are still patterns we have not fully recognized, or that human history, like the continents themselves, may have shifted in ways we are only beginning to understand. And so the question remains, not as a claim of what was, but as a quiet uncertainty beneath the waves. How much of Earth's forgotten past lies still hidden in the depths, waiting not to confirm our myths, but to challenge the limits of what we think we already know. As the narrative moves away from the submerged geological memory of Lemuria, the ocean gives way to another kind of silence, one not of water and plate tectonics, but of stone, dust, and time buried inland. In the deserts of North America, far from the Indian Ocean's deep fractures, archaeologists encounter a very different kind of mystery. One that is grounded not in continents lost beneath the sea, but in artifacts that appear, sometimes unexpectedly, to challenge established timelines of human presence. These are the so-called out-of-place artifacts, objects discovered in stratigraphic layers or contexts that do not easily align with conventional archaeological chronology. Among the most discussed are stone tools, carvings, and architectural remnants found in regions where early human activity is still being carefully mapped and debated. Each discovery is a fragment, isolated and incomplete, yet together they create a pattern that invites cautious examination. Mainstream archaeology interprets human migration into the Americas as a gradual process, beginning roughly during the late Ice Age, when groups crossed the Beringia landmass and moved southward through changing environments. This framework is supported by genetic data, radiocarbon dating, and a growing body of excavation evidence across multiple continents. Sites such as Monte Verde in South America and others in North America have helped refine this timeline, showing that human presence is both ancient and complex, but still broadly consistent with post-Ice Age migration models. Yet in some locations, questions remain, not about whether humans were present, but about the details of their earliest movements and adaptations. In riverbeds, cave systems, and eroded terraces, researchers occasionally uncover materials that require careful reevaluation, tool fragments whose dating is debated, or sedimentary contexts that are difficult to interpret due to geological disturbance. These are not definitive contradictions of established history, but rather points of uncertainty within it. What makes these discoveries compelling is not necessarily their age alone, but their context. Why do some artifacts appear in layers that seem older than expected? How do we account for natural processes such as erosion, sediment mixing, or geological upheaval that can shift materials across time? These questions form the foundation of archaeological method itself, where every find must be weighed against both evidence and environmental complexity. In coastal regions that were once exposed during lower sea levels, submerged landscapes add another layer of possibility. During the last ice age, vast stretches of continental shelf were dry land, potentially hosting early human activity. As sea levels rose, those landscapes disappeared beneath oceans, leaving behind only indirect traces. Marine archaeology has begun to map these drowned environments, revealing ancient river channels and settlement-friendly zones now inaccessible to excavation. Could some answers still lie there, beyond the reach of conventional fieldwork? And yet, alongside scientific inquiry, alternative interpretations occasionally surface. Some researchers outside mainstream archaeology propose that human technological development may not have been strictly linear, that knowledge systems could have risen, declined, or dispersed in ways not fully captured by surviving evidence. These ideas often draw attention to gaps in the archaeological record rather than established data, suggesting that absence of evidence might sometimes reflect preservation bias rather than true absence. There are also broader theoretical discussions about how human societies respond to rapid environmental change. The end of the Ice Age was not a gradual transition everywhere. It was marked by abrupt warming, shifting coastlines, and collapsing megafauna populations. In such conditions, entire cultural adaptations could have been lost, leaving only partial traces behind. What we interpret as scarcity of evidence may, in some cases, be the result of overwhelming environmental transformation rather than limited human presence. Still, the discipline remains cautious. Archaeology relies on verifiable context, repeatable dating methods, and careful stratigraphic analysis. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and thus far, no confirmed discoveries have overturned the established timeline of human migration into the Americas. But the ongoing refinement of that timeline reminds us that history is not static. It is reconstructed continuously as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are tested. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these discussions is not any single artifact, but the persistent tension between what is known and what remains uncertain. Every excavation, every sediment core, every radiocarbon date adds clarity, but also occasionally introduces new questions. Why do some regions yield dense archaeological sequences, while others remain almost silent? How much of early human activity has been erased by time, climate, and geological change? And so, as researchers continue to sift through soil, stone, and submerged landscapes, one question lingers quietly beneath the surface of certainty. Are we uncovering the full story of early human presence on Earth, or only the fragments that time and preservation have allowed us to see? As the investigation moves from the contested edges of Ice Age archaeology and submerged continental myths, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Again and again, human curiosity returns to the same idea. Lost lands beneath vanished horizons, civilizations erased not only by time, but by transformation so complete that only fragments remain in memory and myth. From Beringia's drowned steppe to Lemuria's speculative oceanic shadow, the narrative now shifts once more, this time to a name that does not originate in geology or zoology, but in 19th century esoteric literature and comparative mythology: Mu. Unlike earlier ideas of lost continents that began as scientific hypotheses and later drifted into speculation, Mu enters the historical conversation from a different direction entirely. It is not born in laboratory observation or fossil distribution analysis, but in the interpretation of ancient symbols, scattered oral traditions, and the search for a shared origin story beneath global mythologies. And yet, it is precisely this difference in origin that has allowed Mu to persist in cultural imagination with unusual resilience. The modern concept of Mu is most commonly associated with the writings of Augustus Le Plongeon and later James Churchward in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Churchward, in particular, claimed to have translated ancient tablets, allegedly from a priest in India, describing a vast, lost civilization in the Pacific Ocean. According to his interpretation, Mu was a mother continent, a cradle of early civilization that predated known history, stretching across much of what is now the Pacific Basin. In his narrative, Mu was not simply land. It was the origin point of culture itself, a place where early humanity, or proto-human societies depending on interpretation, developed complex knowledge systems long before the rise of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley. From this imagined center, civilization was said to have spread outward across the world, leaving echoes in myths, pyramids, and sacred architecture found in distant and disconnected cultures. From a modern archaeological perspective, there is no physical evidence supporting the existence of a Pacific continent matching Mu's description. Geological studies of the Pacific Basin, including deep-sea drilling and seafloor mapping, reveal a complex system of volcanic island chains, tectonic plates, and oceanic crust formed over millions of years. The idea of a large, continent-sized landmass sinking relatively recently is inconsistent with what is known about plate tectonics and ocean basin formation. And yet, the concept continues to resurface. Why does a scientifically unsupported idea persist across generations of storytelling, spiritual interpretation, and alternative history literature? Part of the answer may lie not in geology, but in psychology and cultural memory. Across many ancient traditions, there are stories of great floods, lost homelands, and civilizations destroyed by overwhelming natural forces. From Mesopotamian flood narratives to Pacific Island oral histories describing rising seas and migrating ancestors, the motif of displacement is remarkably widespread. But does similarity in myth imply a shared historical origin? Or does it reflect something deeper in human experience, the universal memory of environmental change, encoded in symbolic language? Mainstream archaeology and anthropology generally interpret these narratives as metaphorical or as reflections of localized flooding events rather than global continental destruction. During the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, submerging coastal plains across the world. Entire ecosystems disappeared beneath water. For early human societies living along these coasts, such transformations would have been profound, perhaps even myth-making in scale. Could Mu then be a symbolic memory of lost coastal worlds rather than a literal continent? Or is it something else entirely? An idea shaped by fragmented interpretations of global myths stitched together into a single narrative. Churchward's claims, while influential in popular culture, lack verifiable archaeological support. No inscriptions matching his described Nakal tablets have been independently authenticated. No submerged continental structures consistent with a large Pacific landmass have been discovered. And yet, the allure of Mu persists, often appearing in discussions alongside Lemuria, Atlantis, and other hypothetical lost worlds. This pattern itself becomes part of the mystery. Why do distant cultures, separated by oceans and time, so often contain stories of origins that seem to point toward lost homelands? Are these stories independent inventions shaped by similar human experiences of environmental instability? Or do they preserve faint echoes of real events, distorted through generations of oral transmission? The Pacific Ocean, in particular, is central to this discussion. It is the largest and deepest ocean on Earth, containing more water volume than all other oceans combined. Beneath its surface lies a complex geological architecture of subduction zones, volcanic arcs, and microplates. The idea of a single submerged continent is not supported by this structure, yet the sheer scale of the ocean leaves much of its deep seabed less explored than continental surfaces. Marine archaeology has begun to uncover submerged prehistoric landscapes along continental shelves, areas that were exposed during periods of lower sea levels. In regions such as Southeast Asia and Oceania, these drowned landscapes suggest that early human migration across island chains was far more dynamic than once assumed. Could these partially lost coastal worlds have contributed to the formation of later mythologies about vanished lands? Some alternative interpretations push further, suggesting that Mu represents not a physical continent, but a symbolic memory of early human dispersal across the Pacific Rim. In this view, Mu becomes less a place and more a conceptual origin, a way ancient societies may have encoded migration routes, environmental changes, or shared cultural ancestry. Others go even further, proposing that myths like Mu preserve echoes of a prehistorical cultural network that once connected distant island populations through maritime navigation. While mainstream archaeology recognizes advanced seafaring abilities in ancient Pacific cultures, particularly among Austronesian peoples, the idea of a unified global civilization remains unsubstantiated. Still, the sophistication of early navigation techniques, including star paths, ocean swells, and migratory bird patterns, continues to reshape understanding of prehistoric ocean travel. Could the myth of Mu, then, be an exaggerated reflection of something real, but smaller, more fragmented, and more human than a lost continent? Or does its persistence reveal something more fundamental about how humans construct origins themselves? Across disciplines, one consistent observation emerges. Humanity has always sought a point of beginning, a place before fragmentation, a shared homeland from which complexity unfolded. Whether expressed as sacred geography, mythological continent, or symbolic narrative, this impulse appears repeatedly across cultures separated by vast distances. And so Mu remains suspended between interpretation and imagination. It is neither confirmed nor entirely dismissed in cultural discourse. It simply exists in a space where geology, mythology, and speculation overlap without resolution. Even as modern science maps the Pacific seafloor with increasing precision, identifying ridges, trenches, and volcanic chains in extraordinary detail, the idea of Mu continues to circulate in literature and alternative history. Not as evidence, but as question. What makes a place real in human memory? Is it the physical presence of land beneath water, or the persistence of a story that refuses to disappear, even when the ground beneath it is gone? And beneath the vast, shifting silence of the Pacific, one question lingers without answer. Are we searching for a lost continent, or for the origin of the stories we tell when history itself feels incomplete? Moving deeper into the catalog of humanity's most unsettling archaeological enigmas, the narrative now turns away from imagined continents and submerged oceans and towards something far more grounded, and yet no less elusive. In the high mountains of Peru, where thin air presses against ancient stone, there exists a site that continues to challenge even the most established timelines of pre-Columbian history. Machu Picchu is often described as an Incan citadel, built in the 15th century BC, perched dramatically between two peaks of the Andes. Its stone terraces, precisely cut walls, and astronomical alignments reflect a civilization with extraordinary architectural and engineering capability. The mainstream interpretation holds that it was constructed during the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, serving as a royal estate or ceremonial center, later abandoned during the Spanish conquest. And yet, even within this well-documented framework, subtle uncertainties remain. The precision of the stonework, massive limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, continues to raise questions about the techniques used in its construction. How were such enormous stones transported across steep, unstable terrain without iron tools or wheeled vehicles? How was such architectural accuracy achieved in a high-altitude environment where even modern construction poses logistical challenges? Archaeology provides partial answers. Lever systems, rope techniques, carefully organized labor forces, and generations of accumulated engineering knowledge within Andean societies. The Inca Empire was not isolated. It inherited and refined traditions from earlier cultures such as the Tiwanaku and Wari civilizations. Machu Picchu, in this sense, is not an isolated miracle but part of a long architectural continuum. Still, the site invites deeper reflection. Its location is not random. Perched above the Urubamba River Valley, surrounded by steep cliffs and cloud forests, Machu Picchu appears deliberately integrated into the natural landscape. The alignment of structures with solstices and sacred mountain peaks suggests a worldview in which geography, astronomy, and spirituality were deeply intertwined. This raises a question that goes beyond construction. What did this place represent to those who built it? Was it a retreat for elites, a ceremonial observatory, a political symbol of control over the landscape, or something more layered, where practical governance and sacred geography were inseparable? Some researchers emphasize the completeness of the archaeological record at Machu Picchu, pointing to extensive excavation, documentation, and restoration efforts that have revealed residential areas, agricultural terraces, water channels, and ceremonial spaces. In this view, the site is remarkably well understood compared to many ancient locations worldwide. But even well-mapped sites can hold interpretive ambiguity. The broader Andean region contains layers of older cultural influence that predate the Inca Empire. Civilizations such as Tiwanaku, which flourished near Lake Titicaca, demonstrate architectural sophistication that predates Machu Picchu by centuries, if not longer. Massive stone blocks at Tiwanaku, some weighing over 100 tons, were transported and shaped with precision that still inspires debate about ancient engineering capabilities. Could Machu Picchu be part of a much older tradition of sacred mountain architecture, inherited and adapted across generations? Or does it represent a unique peak in a localized cultural evolution? Beyond mainstream archaeology, alternative interpretations occasionally emerge. Some propose that Andean sites may encode astronomical or geodetic knowledge more advanced than typically credited to pre-industrial societies. Others suggest that ancient civilizations may have possessed lost techniques for stone shaping and transport that were later forgotten. These ideas remain speculative and unverified, but they reflect ongoing fascination with the gap between what survives and what might have been lost. There are also broader environmental considerations. The Andes are not static. They are geologically active, shaped by tectonic uplift and seismic activity. Over centuries, earthquakes and erosion have altered landscapes, potentially destroying or obscuring earlier settlements. How many pre-Inca sites might still lie buried beneath vegetation, landslides, or later construction layers? Modern remote sensing technologies, including LiDAR scanning, have already begun to reveal previously unknown structures in dense forest regions of South America. These discoveries suggest that our understanding of ancient Andean civilization is still evolving. Entire settlement networks may have existed beyond what is currently visible on the surface. And so Machu Picchu becomes not just a site, but a reference point in a much larger archaeological conversation, one that spans known history and the edges of discovery. It represents both clarity and uncertainty, a place where the achievements of a documented civilization stand firmly, yet still invite questions about what came before and what might still be hidden nearby. What remains especially compelling is not the idea that Machu Picchu is unexplained, but that it sits within a broader landscape that is only partially understood. Each terrace, each carved stone, each water channel is a solved detail within an unsolved system. And as the mist rolls over the Andes, obscuring and revealing the ruins in shifting cycles of visibility, one question continues to linger in the quiet between stone and sky. How many layers of human history still lie beneath these mountains, waiting not to overturn what we know, but to deepen the story we have only begun to read? From the cloud-wrapped peaks of the Andes and the stone silence of Machu Picchu, the investigation now shifts away from a single monument, a single civilization, or even a single continent. It moves instead into something far broader, more elusive, an idea that does not belong to one place on Earth, but to all of them at once. Before recorded dynasties, before written language, before the first cities rose in Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley, there exists a conceptual threshold in human thought, a time before the flood, a time often referred to, across cultures and centuries, as the antediluvian world. It is not a place marked on any modern map. There are no coordinates, no verified ruins, no excavation site labeled with certainty. And yet, references to it appear again and again, scattered across ancient texts, oral traditions, and mythological frameworks that predate scientific historiography. A world before the great waters rose, before memory was formalized into writing, before history, as we define it, began. In ancient Mesopotamian literature, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are accounts of a great deluge that reshaped the world and erased earlier generations. Similar flood narratives appear in later texts across multiple regions, including early Hebrew traditions, ancient Greek mythology, Hindu cosmology, and indigenous oral histories from Oceania and the Americas. Each describes, in different language and symbolic structure, a world transformed by water, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as renewal, sometimes as a natural cycle beyond human control. But does similarity imply shared origin? Or does it reflect something more universal in human experience? From a scientific standpoint, the end of the last ice age provides a very real framework for dramatic environmental change. Between approximately 12,000 and 8,000 BC, global sea levels rose significantly as massive ice sheets melted. Coastlines shifted, river systems transformed, and vast low-lying plains were submerged beneath newly formed seas. Entire ecosystems disappeared beneath rising water, including regions that would have been highly suitable for early human settlement. This is not speculation. It is recorded in geological strata, ice cores, and sedimentary evidence across the planet. The Earth did experience a transformation on a global scale. But was it experienced as a single catastrophic flood by early human populations, or as a series of localized environmental changes spread across thousands of years? Archaeology generally supports the latter interpretation. There is no verified evidence of a single global deluge event erasing an advanced civilization in prehistory. Instead, the data points toward gradual but significant climate shifts that reshaped human migration, survival strategies, and settlement patterns over millennia. And yet, the idea of an antediluvian civilization persists. In many traditions, this earlier world is not simply a pre-flood environment, it is described as fundamentally different in character. Some narratives speak of longer-lived generations, lost knowledge systems, or societies that existed in harmony with natural forces in ways later civilizations no longer understood. These descriptions vary widely, but they share a common structure: a remembered before that is qualitatively distinct from the known historical world. Why does this idea appear so consistently across cultures that had no documented contact with one another in antiquity? One explanation lies in shared environmental memory. As early human communities experienced rising waters, shifting coastlines, and disappearing landscapes, these events may have been encoded into oral traditions. Over generations, environmental observations could transform into symbolic narratives, where gradual change becomes a single defining event. In this view, the antediluvian world is not a lost civilization, but a collective memory of transformation. But there are also interpretations that move beyond environmental explanation. Some alternative historical perspectives suggest that fragments of archaeological anomalies, such as unusually early settlement claims, debated tool assemblages, or submerged coastal structures, might hint at more complex pre-Ice Age human activity than currently understood. While mainstream archaeology acknowledges that human behavior predates written history by hundreds of thousands of years, it remains cautious about claims of advanced or globally connected civilizations in deep prehistory. Still, the gaps in the archaeological record are not insignificant. Large portions of Earth's ancient coastlines are now underwater. During periods of lower sea levels, especially during glacial maxima, vast regions of continental shelf were exposed. These areas would have been prime locations for early human habitation, rich in resources, water access, and migratory routes. Yet they are also among the least accessible environments for archaeological excavation today. Marine archaeology has begun to change this picture. Surveys of submerged landscapes off the coasts of Europe, Asia, and the Americas have revealed ancient river systems, lake beds, and terrain features consistent with habitable environments during the late Ice Age. However, connecting these geological features to specific human cultures remains a complex and ongoing challenge. Could parts of the antediluvian idea be rooted not in myth alone, but in partially lost coastal histories, real human settlements now submerged and difficult to study? This question becomes even more intriguing when considering how rapidly human societies adapted to post-Ice Age environmental change. Coastal migration, inland expansion, and technological innovation all accelerated during this transitional period. The archaeological record shows increasing complexity in tool use, symbolic expression, and social organization. Yet the earlier stages of this development remain comparatively sparse in direct evidence. It is within this uncertainty that the concept of an antediluvian civilization finds its persistence, not as a confirmed historical entity, but as a framework for imagining what might exist in the gaps between known sites. Some philosophical interpretations take a different approach altogether. Rather than treating antediluvian civilization as a literal lost society, they view it as a metaphor for prehistory itself, the vast, undocumented span of human existence before writing systems. In this sense, the flood is not a physical event, but a boundary between memory and history. Everything before it is fluid, reconstructed, and partially irretrievable. And yet, even this metaphorical reading does not fully resolve the curiosity it generates. Because beneath the academic frameworks, beneath the geological models and archaeological classifications, there remains a simple and persistent human question. How much of our past is truly gone, and how much is simply not yet understood? Modern technology continues to push into this uncertainty. Advances in DNA analysis have revealed deep ancestral lineages stretching far beyond traditional historical timelines. Improvements in underwater mapping are exposing landscapes that have been hidden for thousands of years. Each discovery refines the picture, but also expands the horizon of what remains unknown. And so the antediluvian world exists in a peculiar state, not as a confirmed chapter of history, nor as a dismissed myth, but as a boundary concept, a space where geology, archaeology, mythology, and human imagination intersect without fully resolving into a single explanation. Was there ever a world before the flood, in the literal sense described in ancient traditions? Or are we looking at something more complex, a layered memory of environmental transformation, cultural storytelling, and the human need to locate a beginning before beginnings were recorded? As the investigation moves forward through ruins, submerged landscapes, and ancient narratives, the question does not disappear. It simply becomes more refined, more difficult, and more fundamental. And somewhere beneath the accumulated sediment of time, beneath rising seas and shifting continents, one final uncertainty remains suspended. Are we studying the remnants of lost civilizations, or the earliest attempts of humanity to explain a world that was already changing long before history ever began? From the shifting idea of an antediluvian world, half memory, half interpretation, the investigation now turns towards something even more unsettling in its persistence. Not a place that may have existed before recorded time, but a pattern of structures, alignments, and artifacts that appear across the globe with a strange, recurring geometry. Across deserts, mountains, and coastal plains, ancient sites often reveal a quiet but striking consistency. Precise astronomical orientation, symbolic repetition, and architectural forms that seem to echo one another despite vast distances and cultural separation. From the pyramids of Egypt to stepped temples in Mesoamerica, from stone circles in Europe to megalithic foundations in Asia, there is a shared language written not in words, but in stone and sky. And yet, each of these civilizations developed independently, separated by oceans and millennia. Or did they? Mainstream archaeology explains these similarities through convergent development. Human societies, regardless of geography, face similar environmental challenges. The need to track seasons, predict agricultural cycles, and orient structures toward celestial bodies naturally leads to comparable solutions. The sun rises in the east everywhere on Earth. The solstices mark universal turning points. The night sky, though interpreted differently, remains a shared canvas. In this view, the resemblance between distant ancient cultures is not evidence of contact, but of shared observation of the same natural world. And yet, some patterns feel difficult to reduce to coincidence alone. Consider the precision of certain ancient constructions. The Great Pyramid of Giza, aligned closely with cardinal directions. Stone circles in Britain oriented toward solstitial horizons. Temple complexes in the Americas aligned with Venus cycles or solar zeniths. These are not random arrangements. They reflect deliberate, repeated attention to astronomical phenomena across cultures that, according to current timelines, had no direct communication. So the question becomes not whether ancient people observed the sky, they clearly did, but how deeply that observation influenced the architecture of entire civilizations. In archaeological interpretation, these alignments are typically understood as expressions of ritual, agriculture, and cosmology. The sky was not separate from daily life. It was part of it. Timekeeping was survival. Seasons determined harvests. Celestial bodies often held religious significance, becoming embedded in sacred architecture. But beyond these accepted explanations, alternative interpretations sometimes emerge at the edges of academic discussion. Some researchers propose that ancient civilizations may have shared more indirect connections than previously assumed, through early maritime contact, lost coastal networks, or now submerged migration routes that have yet to be fully explored. During periods of lower sea levels in the Ice Age, vast stretches of continental shelf were exposed. These regions could have supported human movement and interaction in ways that are now invisible beneath modern oceans. If such routes existed, they would not necessarily leave clear, easily interpretable traces in the surviving archaeological record. Marine archaeology has only recently begun to systematically investigate these drowned landscapes. Early results show river channels, habitation-friendly zones, and geological formations consistent with environments capable of supporting human settlement. But connecting these features to specific cultural exchange remains an open challenge. And so the question quietly deepens. Are we seeing independent invention or fragmented echoes of a more interconnected prehistoric world that has been partially erased by rising seas? Beyond questions of contact, there is also the matter of knowledge transmission itself. Some ancient architectural and astronomical knowledge appears surprisingly advanced for its time. This has led to debates about whether certain societies preserved and refined observational techniques over long periods, accumulating knowledge across generations without written continuity in the modern sense. In this interpretation, ancient monument builders were not inheritors of a lost global civilization, but participants in a long chain of empirical observation, tracking stars, shadows, and seasonal cycles with extraordinary care. Over centuries, such knowledge could produce architectural precision that appears sudden or anomalous when viewed through a compressed historical timeline. Still, the feeling of pattern remains difficult to ignore. Why do so many ancient structures emphasize similar celestial events? Why do foundational myths across continents often involve cosmic order, floods, or divine instruction tied to the heavens? Are these shared motifs the result of independent human cognition responding to the same environment? Or do they hint at deeper, earlier layers of cultural diffusion that have not yet been fully reconstructed? Archaeology, at its core, works with what survives. Stone endures, wood decays, organic materials vanish. Entire knowledge systems can disappear without leaving obvious traces. This is not speculation. It is a fundamental limitation of preservation. What we study today is only a fraction of what once existed. And so the global pattern of ancient monuments becomes something like a fragmented map, not of a single lost civilization, but of repeated attempts across time and geography to understand the same sky above. But even that explanation does not fully settle the unease these sites sometimes evoke. Because patterns, once noticed, tend to persist in interpretation. They begin to connect, even when evidence does not explicitly link them. From the vast patterns of ancient monuments scattered across continents, stone aligned with stars, temples echoing celestial cycles, and symbols repeating across impossible distances, the investigation now narrows into a single, extraordinary site. But paradoxically, the closer we look, the less familiar the past becomes. In southeastern Anatolia, on a windswept limestone ridge overlooking the plains of Upper Mesopotamia, lies Göbekli Tepe. At first glance, it appears almost unremarkable from a distance. A low mound rising gently from the earth, its contours blending into the natural landscape. There are no towering pyramids, no visible city walls, no signs of a settlement in the conventional sense. And yet beneath this quiet hill lies one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries of the modern era. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing several tons, arranged in circular enclosures. Intricately carved reliefs depicting animals, foxes, snakes, boars, vultures, moving across stone surfaces with a deliberate sense of composition. Abstract symbols etched into rock, their meanings still debated. And perhaps most striking of all, the age of the site itself. Göbekli Tepe dates back to approximately 9,600 BC, making it more than 11,000 years old. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. It predates the earliest known cities. It predates, by a significant margin, the rise of agriculture in the region. And that is where the quiet disruption begins. Because according to long-standing models of human development, complex monumental architecture arises after the development of settled agricultural societies. Stable food supplies lead to permanent settlements. Permanent settlements lead to social stratification. Social stratification enables coordinated large-scale construction. But Göbekli Tepe appears to invert that sequence. Here, monument building seems to precede widespread agriculture in the region. Or at least, it emerges in a transitional period where evidence of full sedentary farming is still developing. This has led archaeologists to reconsider earlier assumptions about the relationship between ritual life, social organization, and the origins of civilization. Was Göbekli Tepe built by hunter-gatherer groups who organized themselves in ways previously thought impossible for their time? Or does it represent a stage of social complexity that modern archaeology is only beginning to understand? Excavations led by Klaus Schmidt and later teams have revealed that the site was deliberately buried in antiquity. The enclosures were gradually covered with fill material, preserving the pillars beneath layers of sediment. Why this was done remains uncertain. Was it abandonment? Ritual closure? A cyclical cultural practice whose meaning has been lost? The carvings themselves add another layer of intrigue. Animals dominate the reliefs, but they are not random depictions of local fauna. The arrangement of figures appears intentional, almost narrative in certain sections. Predators and prey are juxtaposed. Birds appear in symbolic clusters. Some pillars feature human-like arms and hands carved into the stone, suggesting that the T-shape may represent stylized anthropomorphic figures. What kind of worldview places such emphasis on symbolic stone beings long before writing systems existed in the region? Mainstream interpretation suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual or ceremonial center, a gathering place where dispersed groups of hunter-gatherers assembled seasonally, perhaps for religious, social, or communal purposes. In this view, the site represents a shared symbolic system rather than an urban settlement, a place not of permanent habitation, but of meaning. Yet even within this framework, questions remain open. How were such massive pillars quarried, transported, and erected without the use of metal tools or wheel-based transport? Archaeological experiments suggest that coordinated labor, simple tools, and extensive planning could achieve such feats, even in pre-agricultural societies. Human capacity for organization may have been underestimated in earlier models. Still, the scale of coordination implied by Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary for its time. It suggests that early human groups were capable of sustained collective effort far beyond what was previously assumed for the pre-pottery Neolithic period. This has led to a broader reevaluation of cognitive and social complexity in early human societies. But there is another dimension to the site that resists easy categorization: its symbolic density. Unlike later agricultural settlements, where symbolic systems often become standardized into writing or formal iconography, Göbekli Tepe exists in a purely pre-literate symbolic space. Its meaning is not recorded in text. It is encoded in stone. This raises a fundamental question. What kind of knowledge system builds monuments without writing, yet with such consistent symbolic structure? Some researchers propose that the site reflects an early form of mythological cosmology, an oral tradition expressed through architecture rather than script. In this interpretation, each enclosure could represent a narrative space, a ritual diagram, or a cosmological map. Others suggest that Göbekli Tepe may reflect a broader regional network of shared symbolic practices, linking scattered groups across Upper Mesopotamia in ways that left little material trace beyond ceremonial centers. And then there are more speculative interpretations that occasionally surface outside mainstream archaeology. Some propose that Göbekli Tepe represents the remnants of a forgotten transitional culture, an intermediary stage between mobile hunter-gatherers and early agricultural societies that was more complex than previously understood. Others, operating further outside established frameworks, suggest the possibility of lost knowledge traditions preserved through oral transmission over millennia, later disrupted by climatic and social change. These ideas remain unverified, but they persist because Göbekli Tepe itself disrupts expectation. It is not merely its age that challenges conventional narratives. It is the combination of age, scale, symbolism, and apparent intentional burial that creates a sense of something partially obscured. And perhaps most intriguing is what is still not fully excavated. Only a fraction of the site has been uncovered. Ground-penetrating surveys suggest that additional enclosures lie buried beneath the surrounding mound. Each layer potentially adds more complexity to an already unexpected picture of early human organization. What was happening here over 11 millennia ago, on a hill overlooking a prehistoric landscape that no longer exists? At that time, the region was undergoing significant environmental transformation. The end of the last ice age brought shifting climates, changing vegetation zones, and migrating animal populations. Human groups would have been adapting continuously to these conditions, moving seasonally, tracking resources, and reconfiguring social structures in response to environmental pressure. Could Göbekli Tepe represent a response to that transformation? A place where dispersed groups came together not only for ritual purposes, but for coordination, knowledge exchange, or social restructuring in a changing world? Or does it reflect something even more foundational? A moment when symbolic thought, collective identity, and architectural expression converged in a way that fundamentally shaped the trajectory of human civilization? The absence of domestic structures at the site remains striking. There is little evidence of long-term habitation, hearth-centered living spaces, or agricultural infrastructure. Instead, everything points toward gathering, construction, and symbolic activity. A place built for coming together, then deliberately covered and left behind. Why would a community invest immense labor into constructing monumental enclosures only to bury them later? Was it renewal? Closure? A belief system tied to cycles of construction and concealment? Or something else entirely, no longer legible through surviving evidence? As excavation continues, each new discovery at Göbekli Tepe refines the picture, but also expands its uncertainty. The site does not settle into a simple narrative. Instead, it opens new lines of inquiry into the origins of ritual behavior, social organization, and symbolic expression in early human societies. And so Göbekli Tepe remains suspended between clarity and mystery, a place firmly grounded in archaeological fact, yet still resisting full interpretation. A reminder that the earliest chapters of human history may not be a gradual ascent toward complexity, but something far more intricate, still only partially visible beneath layers of time. And as more of the mound is carefully removed, revealing pillar after pillar beneath the soil, one question continues to linger in the silence of the excavation site. How much of early human civilization have we truly uncovered? And how much still lies buried, waiting to reshape everything we think we understand about our own beginnings? And yet, even as Göbekli Tepe reshapes our understanding of the earliest known monumental spaces, it does not stand alone in the highlands and plateaus of Anatolia. It is part of a broader, still unfolding archaeological horizon, one that suggests this region was not an isolated anomaly, but a center of early experimentation in how humans gathered, built, and gave meaning to place. A few hundred kilometers to the southwest, the landscape shifts again. The rugged limestone ridges give way to a wide alluvial plain, where fertile soil spreads outward like a slow breath across the land. Here, rivers branch and rejoin, feeding early agriculture long before it became fully established elsewhere. And within this landscape emerges another extraordinary sight, one that feels, in many ways, like the conceptual opposite of Göbekli Tepe. This is the settlement of Çatalhöyük. If Göbekli Tepe is defined by separation, open ritual space, monumental enclosures, and gathering structures built on a hill, Çatalhöyük is defined by compression, a dense, tightly packed settlement where thousands of people once lived in close proximity, not arranged along streets or open plazas, but clustered together in a continuous mass of interconnected dwellings. From above, it would not have resembled a city in any familiar sense. There were no roads, no clear public squares, no visible hierarchy in urban layout. Instead, houses were built directly against one another, forming a continuous surface of mud brick architecture. Entry was not through doors at ground level, but through roofs. Ladders descended into interior rooms carved into a shared architectural continuum. To move through Çatalhöyük was not to walk streets, but to traverse rooftops. At first glance, this arrangement seems almost counterintuitive. Why would a large, settled population design its living space in such a way? Yet the archaeological record suggests that this was not chaotic improvisation, but a long-standing and stable pattern of habitation. Inside these tightly packed homes, archaeologists have uncovered richly layered domestic spaces, walls painted with geometric patterns, floors repeatedly plastered over and renewed, platforms used for sleeping and daily activity. And beneath these floors, something even more striking: the dead. Burials at Çatalhöyük were often placed beneath house floors, within the very spaces of daily life. Generations of inhabitants lived literally above their ancestors. This practice suggests a deeply integrated relationship between domestic space, memory, and identity. The boundary between the living and the dead was not spatially separate. It was layered. And yet, for all its density, Çatalhöyük reveals something unusual about social organization. There is little evidence of centralized authority in the form of palaces, administrative buildings, or monumental public structures. Instead, the settlement appears relatively uniform in house size and construction. This has led many researchers to propose that Çatalhöyük may have been a comparatively egalitarian society, at least in its spatial and material expression. But equality in architecture does not necessarily reveal equality in social experience. Within the homes, symbolic imagery dominates the archaeological record. Wall paintings depict hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and abstract motifs. Sculpted figurines, often female in form, appear in both domestic and ritual contexts. Some of the most famous finds include seated female figures associated with animals, though their exact meaning remains unresolved. Were these representations of deities, ancestral figures, fertility symbols, or something more complex, embodying multiple layers of meaning that shifted depending on context and use? The absence of written language leaves these questions open. Meaning is present, but not explicitly defined. It exists in repetition, placement, and material association. And then there is the architecture itself, which continues to raise questions that resist simple explanation. Many houses were rebuilt multiple times in the same location, often following similar layouts. Over centuries, the settlement appears to have grown vertically as much as horizontally, with older structures buried beneath newer ones. This creates a stratified urban landscape, where time itself becomes architectural. But why maintain such density without expansion into more open space? Why continue to rebuild within the same constrained footprint for so long? Some interpretations suggest that proximity was essential for social cohesion in early agricultural communities. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, Shared irrigation knowledge, coordinated farming cycles, and communal labor, tight spatial organization may have reinforced social bonds. Others propose that cultural or symbolic factors played a stronger role. The roof-based movement system, the absence of streets, and the inward-facing architecture could indicate a worldview in which private and communal life were tightly interwoven, without the sharp spatial divisions seen in later urban planning. Yet even this does not fully explain the intensity of symbolic life within the settlement. From the layered emergence of early civilization, where cities rise almost simultaneously across distant river valleys, and symbolic thought seems to crystallize into architecture and writing, the narrative now shifts again. But this time, the focus is not on what appeared in history's visible record, but on what may have disappeared before it could ever be recorded. Because beneath the waters of Southeast Asia lies a landscape that once connected continents. A submerged world stretching across what is now the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the surrounding archipelagos. A place geologists refer to not as myth, but as a real prehistoric landmass system shaped by Ice Age sea level changes. A place known in modern discussion as Sundaland. Today it is fragmented into islands: Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and countless smaller formations scattered like broken pieces of a vast geological puzzle. But during the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower, these islands were not isolated at all. They were part of a continuous expanse of lowland plains, river systems, and coastal environments stretching across Southeast Asia. A world that is now mostly underwater. And so the question quietly emerges: what kind of human presence once existed there? Mainstream archaeology confirms that Sundaland was indeed inhabited. Stone tools, fossil evidence, and genetic studies all support the presence of early human populations across this region tens of thousands of years ago. Homo sapiens, along with earlier hominin groups, moved through these landscapes, adapting to shifting climates, following river corridors, and exploiting rich ecological zones. But what remains uncertain is not whether people lived there, but what scale of cultural development may have existed before rising seas transformed the geography entirely. Because Sundaland was not marginal land, it was one of the most biologically productive regions on Earth during the Pleistocene. Tropical forests, freshwater systems, coastal ecosystems, and abundant megafauna would have made it a highly favorable environment for sustained human habitation. In such conditions, population density and cultural complexity can increase rapidly. Yet today, most of that ancient landscape lies beneath meters of sediment and seawater. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, particularly between roughly 14,000 and 7,000 BC, vast portions of Sundaland were gradually submerged. This was not a single catastrophic flood, but a long, accelerating transformation. Coastlines retreated, rivers became estuaries, plains became shallow seas, entire habitats disappeared beneath the rising ocean. For the people living there, this would not have been an abstract geological process. It would have been a lived experience of displacement across generations. Villages moving inland, resource zones shifting, migration routes changing, coastal settlements vanishing beneath encroaching tides. But here lies the difficulty for archaeology. Rising seas do not preserve easily. They erase. Unlike desert environments or high-altitude regions where artifacts can survive for millennia, tropical and submerged environments are hostile to long-term preservation. Organic materials decay rapidly. Coastal settlements are often destroyed or buried under marine sediment. Entire cultural layers can disappear without leaving easily identifiable traces. So what we know of Sundaland today is necessarily incomplete. Modern marine geology has reconstructed parts of this lost landscape. Bathymetric mapping reveals ancient river channels, lake basins, and drainage systems now submerged beneath shallow seas. These are not random formations. They are the skeleton of a once exposed continent-sized region. In some reconstructions, Sundaland appears almost like a modern-day extension of mainland Southeast Asia, with peninsulas and lowland corridors connecting regions that are now separated by ocean. During glacial periods, humans could have moved across these landscapes without encountering the barriers we see today. But what kind of societies developed in such a vast and interconnected environment? Mainstream anthropology suggests that prehistoric Sundaland populations were hunter-gatherers, gradually transitioning toward more complex subsistence strategies as environmental conditions changed. Over time, rising sea levels would have fragmented these populations, forcing adaptation to island environments and contributing to the development of diverse cultural and linguistic groups across Southeast Asia and Oceania. This interpretation is supported by genetic evidence. Modern populations in the region carry deep ancestral lineages that reflect ancient migrations and long-term habitation of Southeast Asia. Linguistic diversity across island Southeast Asia and the Pacific also suggests multiple waves of migration and cultural differentiation over extended periods. But there is still a gap between what we know of these populations and what the drowned landscape itself might once have contained. Because Sundaland was not a narrow corridor, it was vast, and vast environments tend to support complex and interconnected human systems, especially when stable for long periods. This is where interpretation begins to diverge. Some researchers propose that Sundaland may have supported early cultural networks that were far more interconnected than previously assumed. Not necessarily a civilization in the classical sense of cities and written language, but perhaps a web of maritime adapted societies linked by coastal travel, seasonal movement, and shared symbolic traditions. In such a scenario, knowledge would not be centralized. It would be distributed across islands, rivers, and coastal zones. Oral traditions, navigation systems, ecological knowledge, and ritual practices could have been shared across vast distances without leaving the kind of durable archaeological signatures typically associated with urban civilizations. But as sea levels rose, these networks would have been fragmented. Isolated island populations would evolve independently. Shared traditions would diverge. Cultural memory of a connected lowland world might gradually transform into myth, origin stories, or symbolic references to lost homelands. This is one possible lens through which to interpret recurring flood narratives found across maritime Southeast Asia and surrounding regions. Stories of ancestral lands lost beneath water, islands emerging from or disappearing into the sea, journeys across oceans guided by memory of earlier worlds. Mainstream anthropology interprets these narratives as symbolic reflections of real environmental change during post-Ice Age sea level rise. They are not considered literal historical accounts of a single lost civilization, but rather cultural memories shaped by long-term ecological transformation. Yet the emotional consistency of these narratives across widely separated island cultures continues to draw attention. Why do so many oral traditions in maritime Southeast Asia reference submerged homelands, ancestral migrations from now lost regions, or transformative encounters with rising waters? Is this simply the expected outcome of living in a region defined by islands and seas? Or does it reflect something deeper about how human societies encode environmental memory over thousands of years? Archaeology offers partial answers, but the submerged nature of Sundaland complicates direct investigation. Underwater excavation in tropical seas is challenging. Sediment accumulation, biological activity, and shifting currents all obscure potential sites. Unlike dry land archaeology, where stratigraphy can be carefully peeled back layer by layer, submerged landscapes require specialized methods: sonar mapping, sub-bottom profiling, and targeted diving expeditions. Even then, only small portions of the drowned landscape can be examined in detail. And so Sundaland remains largely invisible, not because it is unimportant, but because it is difficult to access. This raises a critical methodological question. How much of early human history lies in environments that are simply not well preserved or not yet fully explored? If entire regions of prehistoric habitation are submerged beneath continental shelves, then the archaeological record we rely on is inherently skewed toward survivable environments: deserts, highlands, caves, and arid zones. Coastal and lowland societies, which may have been equally or even more significant in population and cultural development, are disproportionately underrepresented. In this sense, Sundaland is not just a lost landmass. It is a reminder of a structural limitation in how we reconstruct the past. Even the most advanced models of prehistoric migration and cultural development must account for missing data. Entire landscapes that once supported human life but are now underwater and largely inaccessible. Some alternative interpretations take this further, suggesting that our understanding of early cultural development may be incomplete not only in detail, but in scale. That prehistoric Southeast Asia may have supported more extensive and interconnected human systems than currently documented, later fragmented by rising seas into the diverse cultural landscape we see today. These interpretations remain speculative, but they arise from a real tension between environmental reconstruction and archaeological visibility. Because when a landscape disappears beneath the ocean, it does not vanish from human history, it simply becomes harder to see. And so Sundaland occupies a unique position in the study of human origins. It is not a myth like Atlantis or Mu. It is a real geological region with confirmed prehistoric habitation. But it is also not fully understood, because much of its surface has been erased by time and water. What remains is a partial reconstruction, a drowned world inferred through fragments, models, and distant echoes. And as research continues, through underwater mapping, genetic studies, and regional archaeology, the image becomes clearer in some respects, but still incomplete in others. So the question does not resolve itself. Instead, it expands. What happens to human history when the places most suitable for early settlement are the ones most likely to disappear? And beneath the quiet, submerged plains of Sundaland, now lying under the weight of oceans and sediment, one final uncertainty lingers. Are we looking at a simple prehistoric landscape lost to rising seas, or at the fragmented remains of an entire chapter of human experience that has yet to be fully reconstructed from beneath the water? From the submerged plains of Sundaland, where ancient river systems now lie buried beneath tropical seas, the investigation moves once again, following the same unsettling pattern that has appeared throughout this journey. Lost land becomes submerged memory. Submerged memory becomes fragmented myth. And fragmented myth becomes the foundation for new questions. Because if vast prehistoric landscapes like Sundaland were gradually erased by rising seas, then the story of human antiquity is not only one of discovery, but also one of disappearance. Entire worlds may have existed long before writing, long before cities, long before anything we could easily recognize as civilization, and yet left almost no visible trace. And this leads to one of the most provocative ideas that repeatedly emerges at the edges of archaeology, mythology, and speculative history: the possibility that human civilization itself may have deeper roots than the surviving record suggests. Not in the sense of modern cities or industrial societies, but in the sense of organized knowledge, symbolic systems, and large-scale cultural memory existing far earlier than traditionally assumed. This is where the discussion becomes delicate, because the archaeological record is both revealing and restrictive. It shows a clear trajectory: early hominins, then symbolic behavior, then gradual technological complexity, and eventually agriculture and urban life. This sequence is supported by abundant evidence across multiple continents. But it is also a record shaped by preservation. Stone survives. Bone survives under certain conditions. Architecture survives only when not submerged, buried too deeply, or destroyed by geological forces. Organic cultures, those built primarily from wood, fiber, and ephemeral materials, leave far fewer traces, especially over tens of thousands of years. So when we speak about early human history, we are always speaking through a filter of survival bias. And that filter becomes especially important when considering environments like coastal plains, river deltas, and lowland tropical regions, precisely the kinds of places where early human populations are believed to have concentrated. These are also the same environments most likely to be submerged or heavily altered over time. This is where Sundaland, Beringia, and other drowned landscapes begin to form a connected pattern, not as evidence of a single lost civilization, but as a reminder of how much of the prehistoric world now lies underwater, out of direct reach. But alongside this scientific understanding, a parallel current of interpretation has persisted for centuries. Ancient traditions across the world sometimes describe earlier ages of humanity characterized by greater harmony, different environmental conditions, or cycles of destruction and renewal. In some cases, these narratives speak of knowledge lost after great floods or cosmic upheavals. In others, they describe transitions between eras of human existence that feel more symbolic than historical. Mainstream scholarship generally interprets these as mythological frameworks, ways of encoding environmental change, social disruption, or psychological experience into narrative form. Yet the recurrence of similar motifs across geographically distant cultures continues to attract attention. Why do so many independent traditions reference floods? Why do so many describe a world that existed before the present one? And why does the idea of lost knowledge persist so strongly in human storytelling? One explanation is environmental realism. Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age were not localized events. They were global. Coastal populations everywhere experienced transformation. River systems changed. Migration routes shifted. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath water. For communities experiencing these changes over generations, the psychological impact would have been immense. In oral cultures, where memory is preserved through storytelling rather than writing, such experiences can become compressed into single defining narratives. Gradual change becomes a great flood. Long transitions become a lost world. And multiple generations of adaptation become a single mythic rupture. But even if this explanation is sufficient, it does not fully erase the deeper fascination these stories provoke. Because beneath the mythic language lies a consistent intuition that human history may contain layers that are no longer visible. And archaeology, in its most honest form, often agrees with this in principle, even if it avoids speculation about what those layers contained. The archaeological record is not complete. It is partial by nature. Every excavation reveals not only what was preserved, but also what was not. This is especially true for deep prehistory, where time itself acts as both recorder and eraser. Which brings the discussion back to a fundamental tension. We are reconstructing human history from fragments that survived environmental, geological, and chemical filters spanning tens of thousands of years. So the question is not whether gaps exist. The question is what those gaps represent. Are they simply empty spaces where nothing significant occurred? Or are they regions of history where human activity once existed, but left little behind for us to recover? Modern research continues to push into these uncertainties. Underwater archaeology is expanding. Ancient DNA analysis is revealing deeper population histories. Satellite imaging is uncovering hidden landscape features beneath vegetation and sediment. Slowly, the edges of the unknown are being mapped. But the center remains elusive. because every new discovery tends to refine the past rather than fully reconstruct it. And so, even as we move forward in time, toward early cities, early states, and early written records, the deeper question does not disappear. It simply changes form. What came before those systems? What was lost when landscapes disappeared beneath rising seas? And how much of early human experience exists only as absence in the archaeological record? Because if entire worlds once existed along now submerged coastlines, if vast regions of human habitation were gradually erased by environmental change, then our understanding of origins is always provisional, built on what remains, not what once was. And somewhere beneath that realization, beneath the silence of drowned landscapes and incomplete records, one final uncertainty continues to echo through the investigation. Are we uncovering the true scale of humanity's deep past, or only the narrow surviving edge of a much larger story that time has not yet allowed us to fully recover? Just beneath the restless surface of the North Sea, where cold winds still sweep across modern coastlines and fishing vessels trace invisible routes over deep water, there lies a landscape that once held rivers, forests, and human footsteps. A place now known as Doggerland. It is not a myth in the traditional sense, nor a legend passed down through oral memory. It is something more unsettling in its simplicity, a lost world confirmed by geology, archaeology, and the slow, patient reading of sediments pulled from the seabed. Yet what remains uncertain is not its existence, but its full story. Between what is now the eastern coast of Britain and the shores of northwestern Europe, Doggerland once formed a vast stretch of low-lying terrain. During the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower, this region was not water at all, but a living bridge of land. A wide, rolling plain where rivers carved their paths toward ancient coastlines, and where herds of animals once migrated across open tundra and wetlands. And where humans, too, are believed to have lived, hunted, and disappeared. Archaeological evidence recovered from dredged sediments and underwater surveys reveals fragments that hint at a human presence: stone tools, worked flints, bone remnants, and traces of prehistoric settlements now fragmented beyond recognition. These discoveries do not form a complete picture. Instead, they appear like scattered pieces of a puzzle whose central image has been erased. What kind of societies once moved through this vanished land? Some researchers describe Doggerland as a rich Mesolithic environment, populated by small bands of hunter-gatherers who followed seasonal patterns across forests and marshes. In this view, it was not a civilization in the later sense of cities or monuments, but a deeply interconnected ecological world, one where human survival was tied intimately to the rhythms of land, water, and migrating game. But then comes the question that lingers beneath the scientific reconstructions. How much of this world is still unknown, buried under sediment and silence? Because Doggerland did not simply fade away. It was lost. As the last ice age ended, global temperatures rose, glaciers melted, sea levels began to rise gradually but relentlessly. Over centuries, and then millennia, the encroaching waters of the Atlantic pushed inward. Coastlines shifted. Marshes turned to shallow bays. Rivers became estuaries. And slowly, inevitably, the land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe began to break apart. Yet some interpretations suggest that this process may not have been entirely slow in every phase. Core samples taken from the North Sea floor reveal signs of sudden environmental change: tsunami deposits, abrupt sediment layers, and evidence of large-scale flooding events. One of the most discussed hypotheses involves a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, which may have triggered a tsunami powerful enough to sweep across parts of Doggerland's remaining lowlands. If this event reached inhabited regions, even partially, It may have transformed a gradual disappearance into something far more catastrophic. A land not simply abandoned, but erased in a moment of geological violence. Still, certainty remains elusive. The evidence is fragmentary, and the reconstruction of ancient coastlines depends on models that are continually refined. Some scholars argue that while flooding events occurred, the broader submergence of Doggerland was still primarily a slow, climate-driven process. Others suggest that a combination of both gradual and sudden forces shaped its end, leaving behind a patchwork of drowned valleys and isolated highlands. And yet, beneath these debates lies a deeper mystery. What happened to the people? There is no written record, no oral tradition that can be confidently traced back to Doggerland itself, no surviving cultural memory preserved in later European mythologies that can be definitively linked to its disappearance. If communities lived and died there for thousands of years, their stories have dissolved almost completely into the sediment of the sea. Only objects remain. A finely worked flint tool, shaped by human hands thousands of years ago, now recovered from the seabed like a message without language. A fragment of antler, possibly carved or modified. A bone that may have once been part of a tool or weapon. Each artifact suggests intention, skill, and adaptation, but not identity. This absence of narrative creates space for speculation. Some researchers cautiously suggest that Doggerland may have been more densely populated than previously assumed, especially during its final stages, when shrinking landmass forced communities into closer proximity. In such conditions, competition for resources would have intensified, migration routes would have narrowed. Social structures may have changed under pressure, reshaping how groups interacted with one another. Others go further, imagining a world of fragmented territories, small, isolated communities cut off by rising waters, gradually losing contact with one another. In this view, Doggerland was not a single unified land, but a fading mosaic of human presence, slowly unraveling as geography itself dissolved. And then there are the more speculative interpretations, which emerge not from established archaeology, but from attempts to fill the silence. Some propose that oral memories of a great flooding event may have survived indirectly in later mythologies across Europe. Stories of submerged lands, great deluges, and lost worlds appear in various ancient traditions. While there is no direct evidence linking these myths to Doggerland, the coincidence invites reflection. Could fragments of real events have persisted, transformed over time into symbolic narratives? Others consider whether the rapid disappearance of coastal regions might have left psychological imprints on early human populations, memories of loss embedded deeply enough to echo across generations in mythic form, not as history, but as archetype. Still, caution remains essential. Archaeology resists easy storytelling. It deals in fragments, not wholes. And Doggerland, more than most ancient landscapes, resists completion. What is perhaps most compelling is not what is known, but what is absent. No settlements have been fully excavated. No large-scale structures have been identified beneath the North Sea. No definitive burial sites have been confirmed. If such evidence exists, it lies buried under layers of sand, silt, and time, or has been destroyed by shifting currents and glacial forces. Modern technology, however, has begun to change what can be seen. Seismic surveys originally designed for oil exploration have revealed hidden river channels etched into the seabed. Ancient lake beds appear as faint contours beneath sediment layers. In some areas, the submerged landscape is so well preserved that it can be digitally reconstructed in remarkable detail, revealing a terrain that once looked strikingly familiar: hills, valleys, estuaries, and coastlines shaped by wind and water. Yet, even with these reconstructions, the human element remains elusive. We can map the land, but we cannot yet fully recover the lives that moved across it. And so Doggerland exists today in a strange dual state, scientifically real, yet emotionally unreachable. A place that can be measured, but not fully imagined. A world that once supported life, now existing only as a shadow beneath another sea. It raises a quiet, persistent question. How many other landscapes like this have existed throughout Earth's history? Entire regions of human experience now lost beneath oceans, deserts, or ice sheets, waiting without certainty for rediscovery? And perhaps more unsettling still, what traces of Doggerland remain undiscovered, lying just beyond the reach of current methods, waiting in the silence of the deep? As research continues and the North Sea yields its secrets slowly, Doggerland remains suspended between fact and absence. A reminder that the map of human history is still incomplete, and that beneath familiar waters, unfamiliar worlds may still be waiting. Somewhere under that cold, shifting surface, the outlines of rivers still exist in stone and sediment. And beneath them, perhaps, the faintest echoes of footsteps that have not been heard for thousands of years. What else might still be resting there, unseen, just beyond the edge of certainty? As the question of Doggerland's disappearance lingers, the story does not end with the first waves of inundation or even the dramatic possibilities of sudden catastrophe. Instead, it continues in the quieter aftermath, an aftermath that unfolded over generations, long after the land itself had begun to vanish beneath the North Sea. What remains especially striking is how disappearance on this scale does not happen all at once. It unfolds unevenly, almost unpredictably. One season, a shoreline might still hold familiar hunting grounds. The next, a river mouth becomes a widening estuary. And later, what was once a familiar forest becomes unreachable marshland cut off by rising tides. For the people who lived there, if we follow the archaeological interpretation, this would not have been a single moment of loss. It would have been a slow rearrangement of reality itself. Imagine standing on a hill in what is now submerged terrain, looking outward across a landscape that no longer behaves as it once did. Water encroaches where dry ground used to be. Paths that once led inland now end abruptly in shifting mudflats. The horizon itself seems to be moving, not metaphorically, but physically reshaping the boundaries of life. How does a society respond when the land beneath it refuses to remain stable? Archaeological models suggest that populations in Doggerland may have gradually shifted toward higher ground and surviving coastal edges, clustering in regions that remained habitable the longest. These refuges would have become increasingly important, places where resources, shelter, and knowledge were concentrated as surrounding territories disappeared beneath the sea. But this concentration raises further questions. Did these remaining communities maintain contact with one another across shrinking distances of land? Or did rising waters eventually fragment them into isolated groups, each adapting independently to increasingly constrained environments? There is no definitive answer preserved in the archaeological record, only patterns suggested by scattered finds beneath the seabed. Stone tools appear in certain clusters, suggesting repeated human activity in specific zones. Animal remains indicate changing hunting practices, possibly reflecting shifts in available species as wetlands replaced forests. These subtle changes hint at adaptation, but they do not reveal the social or emotional experience behind them. And yet, it is precisely this human dimension that remains most elusive. Some researchers propose that the final phases of Doggerland's existence may have involved a kind of cultural compression. As land diminished, populations may have been forced into closer proximity, increasing interaction, cooperation, and perhaps conflict. Resources would have become more localized. Seasonal migration routes may have been disrupted entirely. In such a world, knowledge of the landscape would have been both essential and unstable. Generations that once inherited stable maps of their environment may have found those mental maps becoming obsolete within a single lifetime. What does it mean to inherit a world that is actively disappearing? The geological record offers no direct answer, but it does preserve evidence of environmental stress. Pollen analysis from sediment cores indicates shifts in vegetation patterns, forests giving way to more open environments, wetlands expanding where dry ground once dominated. These ecological changes would have reshaped not only survival strategies, but also cultural identity, as landscapes tied to memory and tradition slowly transformed. Still, the most dramatic aspect of Doggerland's story may not be gradual change, but the possibility that at certain points, the transformation accelerated. The Storegga slide hypothesis continues to stand as one of the most compelling explanations for abrupt flooding events in the region. A massive underwater landslide off the Norwegian continental shelf is believed to have generated a powerful tsunami that radiated across the North Sea basin. If such a wave reached low-lying parts of Doggerland, it could have inundated vast areas in a matter of hours. Sediment layers in certain regions appear to support the presence of sudden marine incursions, with deposits inconsistent with slow tidal processes. These layers suggest forceful, rapid deposition of material, an imprint of water moving with unusual energy. But even here, uncertainty remains. Not all researchers agree on the extent of devastation caused by such an event. Some argue that while the tsunami was real and significant, its impact on human populations in Doggerland may have been more localized than catastrophic. Others suggest that its psychological impact on communities already witnessing long-term environmental change may have been just as important as its physical effects, because even a partial disaster, occurring within a broader pattern of rising seas, can reshape how people understand their world. And so another question emerges. At what point does gradual loss become perceived as sudden collapse? This ambiguity is central to the mystery of Doggerland. The archaeological record does not distinguish clearly between lived experience and geological process. It records change, but not perception. It shows us what happened to the land, but not how it was interpreted by those who stood upon it. After the final submergence, what remained of Doggerland was no longer accessible in the way it once had been. The land bridge between Britain and mainland Europe was gone. What had been a continuous human landscape became separated by water, transforming patterns of migration, communication, and ecological exchange across the region. This separation likely had long-term consequences for prehistoric populations in Europe. Cultural developments diverged on either side of the newly formed sea. Genetic studies suggest complex migration histories that may, in part, reflect the earlier fragmentation of populations tied to Doggerland's disappearance. Yet even these scientific reconstructions cannot fully restore what was lost. Because Doggerland is not only a question of geography, it is also a question of memory. What is preserved, what is erased, and what is never recorded at all. Occasionally, discoveries from the North Sea continue to surface in unexpected ways. Fishing trawlers recover mammoth remains, ancient tree trunks, and prehistoric artifacts embedded in dredged material. Each find is a reminder that beneath modern shipping routes and industrial activity, an ancient landscape still exists in submerged form, preserved in fragments. A forest that once stood, a river that once flowed, a coastline that once defined human movement across continents. And beneath it all, traces of human presence that refuse to fully disappear. Some researchers have begun to explore the possibility that further evidence of structured habitation may still lie undetected in deeper sediment layers, waiting for advances in underwater archaeology and remote sensing technology to reveal them. High-resolution mapping of the seabed continues to refine our understanding of this lost terrain, but vast areas remain unexplored in detail. What might still be hidden there? A settlement pattern not yet recognized? A ritual site preserved beneath protective sediment, or simply more fragments, tools, bones, traces of fire, scattered across an underwater plain that once supported entire communities. Each possibility remains open, yet unconfirmed. And so Doggerland persists not as a solved chapter of prehistory, but as an unfinished investigation. A submerged world that continues to resist complete reconstruction, not because it is unknowable, but because it is only partially visible. It exists at the edge of scientific recovery, mapped, inferred, and partially understood, yet still fundamentally incomplete. And perhaps that is what makes it so enduring in the human imagination. Because beneath the quiet waters of the North Sea, there is still the suggestion of continuity, of landscapes that once connected distant worlds, now divided by depth and time. And as research continues, one final question remains suspended in the silence of that drowned land. How much of Doggerland is truly gone, and how much is still waiting just beyond the reach of what we have learned to see? As the narrative shifts deeper into the ancient layers of human memory, the story moves away from towering stone monuments and well-known empires, descending instead into something quieter, older, and far more elusive. Beneath the familiar histories of kings and cities that would later shape Mesopotamia, there exists a cultural horizon that seems to emerge from the earth itself, an early world of mud brick, reed structures, and slow rivers shaping human survival in ways we are still trying to understand. It is here, in the broad floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, that traces of the Ubaid Civilization begin to appear. Not as sudden monuments or dramatic ruins, but as subtle fingerprints in the soil, fragments of pottery, carefully shaped tools, and the faint outlines of settlements that seem to have expanded almost quietly, without the usual markers of conquest or upheaval. The landscape itself offers little certainty. Flat, shifting, and shaped by rivers that have changed course countless times, it does not preserve history easily. And yet, archaeologists have uncovered something remarkable within it, a pattern of human life that stretches across thousands of years, suggesting a society that was both highly organized and strangely uniform across vast distances. How did such consistency emerge in an age before empires, before written language, before the machinery of centralized power? The earliest excavations revealed a distinctive style of pottery, pale clay, painted with dark geometric patterns that seem almost hypnotic in their repetition. Bowls, jars, and vessels appear across sites separated by hundreds of miles, yet they share an uncanny visual language. Was this the result of shared cultural values, or something more structured? An early form of communication network that has left no written trace behind? As more sites were uncovered, a broader picture began to form. Settlements such as Eridu, and others, now buried beneath centuries of sediment, reveal structured communities with temples built on raised platforms. These were not simple villages. They show evidence of planned architecture, communal spaces, and a recurring focus on what appears to be ritual activity. But what is most striking is not just what was built, but how similarly it was built across regions. The same architectural principles appear again and again: rectangular mud brick structures, central halls, and elevated sacred spaces. It suggests a shared worldview, or perhaps a shared instruction system, passed from community to community. Yet no written records survive to explain how this consistency was maintained. Some scholars describe the Ubaid world as the first true cultural network in southern Mesopotamia, a slow, interconnected web of villages exchanging ideas, goods, and practices over centuries. Others see something more centralized in its uniformity, hinting at early forms of social hierarchy or religious coordination that did not leave behind the typical archaeological signatures of control. And then there are the temples. At sites such as Eridu, Layers of construction reveal repeated rebuilding on the same sacred foundations. Each new structure rises atop the remains of the previous one, as if preserving something essential in place. The continuity is almost ritualistic in itself, suggesting that location held meaning beyond practicality. Why did these communities return to the same sacred points for generations, rebuilding rather than relocating? Within these structures, archaeologists have found evidence of offerings, animal remains, pottery fragments, and carefully arranged deposits. Yet no clear iconography explains the beliefs behind them. There are hints of deities or spiritual forces, but nothing fully defined. It is a religion without a text, a system of meaning preserved only in material traces. This absence of written explanation becomes even more intriguing when contrasted with what comes later. The emergence of writing in Mesopotamia, centuries after the Ubaid period fades, seems almost abrupt in comparison. It raises a quiet but persistent question: how much knowledge existed before writing, and what was lost when oral systems gave way to recorded language? Some researchers suggest that the Ubaid people may have maintained complex oral traditions, passed through generations with precision now difficult to imagine. Others speculate about symbolic systems embedded in pottery designs or settlement layouts, non-written codes that structured society in ways we are only beginning to interpret. But there is another layer of mystery that refuses easy explanation: the remarkable geographic spread of Ubaid cultural traits. From southern Mesopotamia, similar artifacts appear far beyond their expected heartland, reaching into regions that would later become distinct cultural zones. This expansion does not resemble rapid conquest. It feels slower, more diffuse, like a cultural tide spreading across landscapes over centuries. How does a way of life maintain such coherence across distance without obvious political unification? Was it migration, imitation, shared origin, or something else entirely? The archaeological record remains silent on the mechanism. Even more puzzling are the occasional anomalies found within Ubaid contexts. At certain sites, objects appear that do not fit neatly within the expected cultural toolkit. Unusual figurines with elongated features, abstract forms that resist clear interpretation, and architectural variations that break from the dominant pattern. These inconsistencies are rare, but they stand out precisely because everything else appears so uniform. Some interpret these anomalies as evidence of localized experimentation within a broad cultural framework. Others, leaning toward more speculative interpretations, suggest contact with unknown groups or forgotten cultural streams that have left only faint traces in the record. None of these ideas can be confirmed, yet none can be entirely dismissed either. The figurines in particular continue to provoke curiosity. Small, often stylized human forms, they appear in domestic and ritual contexts, their meaning still debated. Are they representations of deities, ancestors, or symbolic markers of identity? Or do they reflect something more abstract, a conceptual language of form that modern interpretation struggles to decode? As layers of sediment are carefully removed, the Ubaid world reveals itself less as a singular civilization and more as a gradual unfolding of shared habits, technologies, and beliefs. There is no clear beginning, no sudden foundation moment. Instead, it seems to emerge slowly from earlier Neolithic communities, refining itself over time until it becomes something archaeologists can recognize as a coherent cultural horizon. Yet, coherence does not always mean clarity. The more we learn, the more the Ubaid world appears as both familiar and distant, recognizable in its human behaviors, yet elusive in its motivations. It is a society that built, organized, and expanded, but left behind no narrative of itself. No kings, no chronicles, no definitive explanation of its internal logic. Even its decline is not sharply defined. The transition into later Mesopotamian cultures, such as the Uruk period, appears gradual, almost seamless in some regions. Cultural elements shift, cities grow larger, social complexity increases, but the Ubaid presence does not vanish in a dramatic rupture. Instead, it dissolves into what comes next, like a foundation being absorbed into a larger structure. Was this transformation peaceful evolution, or the result of pressures we cannot yet see in the archaeological record? Did the Ubaid world change itself, or was it changed by forces beyond its control? There is a temptation, when faced with such gaps, to imagine dramatic explanations. Lost empires, hidden migrations, forgotten catastrophes. Yet the evidence resists easy storytelling. What remains is something more subtle, a long, sustained human presence that shaped the foundations of later civilization without announcing itself loudly in history. And still, beneath the pottery shards and temple foundations, there is an underlying silence that feels almost deliberate, as if the people of this ancient world did not intend to be fully known by future generations, leaving behind just enough to suggest their existence, but not enough to fully reconstruct their thoughts. So the question lingers, as it does in so many early chapters of human history. Are we looking at the remains of a fully understood civilization, or only the surface of something far more complex, waiting beneath the layers of soil and time? In the soil beneath southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers once shifted course with little warning and entire settlements could be abandoned to silt within a single generation, the story of the Ubaid world continues to unfold in fragments rather than chapters. Each excavation seems to peel back not a single timeline, but multiple overlapping versions of human life, some orderly, some ambiguous, and some that refuse to align with anything we currently understand about early societal development. As researchers move from one site to another, a pattern emerges that is both reassuring and unsettling. The material culture remains consistent, almost stubbornly so, yet the context of that culture varies in subtle ways. A pottery style here, a burial arrangement there, a building orientation that shifts by a few degrees, small deviations that accumulate into something difficult to fully map. It raises an uncomfortable question. Was the Ubaid horizon truly uniform, or are we seeing the limits of our ability to interpret continuity across fragmented evidence? At certain locations, the archaeological record suggests settlements that were not merely inhabited, but carefully curated over time. Houses rebuilt in nearly identical footprints, temples reconstructed with minimal deviation from earlier designs. Even refuse deposits appear organized, as though waste itself followed an unspoken structure. It creates the impression of a society deeply invested in repetition, not as stagnation, but as preservation of an underlying order. And yet, repetition alone does not explain the reach of Ubaid influence. Across vast stretches of the ancient river systems, similar artifacts continue to appear, suggesting contact or shared tradition between communities that would have required sustained interaction over generations. The logistics of such continuity in a pre-literate, pre-imperial world remain difficult to conceptualize. Without formal administration or written instruction, what mechanism preserved this cultural coherence? Some archaeologists propose slow migration along waterways, with communities gradually spreading and maintaining contact through kinship and trade. Others suggest seasonal gatherings at sacred or economic nodes, where knowledge and practices were reinforced periodically. These models are plausible, yet they do not fully account for the remarkable stability of symbolic and architectural forms. The temples, in particular, continue to resist simple explanation. Their repeated reconstruction on the same foundations suggests not only reverence for place, but an attachment to continuity that transcends individual lifespans. In some cases, layers of construction reveal centuries of uninterrupted ritual rebuilding. Each generation appears to have inherited not just a structure, but an obligation to maintain its presence in precisely the same location. What was believed to reside there? There are no inscriptions to guide interpretation, no named deities carved into stone. Only architectural intent and scattered offerings remain. Animal remains placed with care, figurines arranged in specific positions, ceramics broken and deposited in ways that suggest ceremony rather than disposal. It is a religion without doctrine, or at least without doctrine that survived the passage of time. And yet, absence of clarity does not mean absence of meaning. On the contrary, the consistency of ritual behavior across sites implies a shared understanding so fundamental that it required no explanation. But what happens when such a system loses its interpretive key? When the symbols remain but the language that once gave them weight disappears? At a few sites, archaeologists have uncovered structures that complicate the dominant narrative of uniformity. These are not dramatic departures, but subtle architectural variations, slightly different spatial arrangements, unexpected room divisions, or unusual alignments with environmental features. They are rare, but their existence suggests localized adaptation within a broader cultural framework. Whether these differences represent experimentation, environmental necessity, or alternative traditions is still debated. Then there are the figurines again, small, enigmatic objects that continue to provoke more questions than answers. Some are humanoid in form, others abstract to the point of ambiguity. A few appear deliberately stylized in ways that emphasize exaggerated features, while others are reduced almost to geometric simplicity. Their distribution across domestic and ritual contexts suggests they were not confined to a single function. Could they have been teaching tools, symbolic representations of social roles, or markers of identity within a shared cultural system? Or do they point toward beliefs that modern categories of interpretation are simply not equipped to decode? In some cases, the figurines appear in deposits that suggest deliberate concealment or closure, placed beneath floors, within walls, or alongside foundation layers of buildings. This pattern hints at rituals tied to construction, transformation, or protection. But again, the meaning remains just out of reach, as if the logic behind the practice dissolves when separated from its original cultural context. The more the Ubaid world is examined, the more it appears as a society operating on principles that are internally coherent, yet externally opaque. It is not chaotic, nor is it fully transparent. It exists in a middle space where structure is evident, but explanation is missing. This becomes especially apparent when considering the relationship between settlements and environment. The Ubaid people lived in a landscape defined by rivers that both sustained and threatened them. Flooding could enrich soil or erase entire habitations, and yet, rather than avoiding these unstable zones, communities repeatedly returned to them. Settlement after settlement appears along the same waterways, as if the benefits outweighed the risks in a way that demanded continual reaffirmation. Beneath the long and layered story of the Ubaid civilization lies a quieter truth, one that resists spectacle and refuses final interpretation. It is a truth built not on sudden revelations or dramatic discoveries, but on persistence, of patterns, of materials, and of human presence stretching across thousands of years in the floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia. What emerges from the archaeological record is not a civilization defined by singular moments of brilliance or collapse, but a slow, almost patient unfolding of shared practices. Mud brick houses rebuilt in familiar footprints, temples raised again and again on the same sacred ground, pottery styles that echo across vast distances with striking consistency. These are not the marks of a forgotten empire, but of something more subtle, a cultural horizon sustained through repetition, adaptation, and continuity. Yet despite this coherence, the Ubaid world remains fundamentally opaque. There are no written records to explain its internal logic, No surviving narratives to describe its beliefs, leaders, or social structures. Instead, there are only traces, fragments of daily life and ritual activity that suggest meaning without ever fully revealing it. Even its expansion across regions defies simple explanation, spreading like a quiet current rather than a force of conquest. Perhaps most intriguing is the absence of rupture. The transition from the Ubaid period into later Mesopotamian civilizations is not marked by collapse or disappearance, but by gradual absorption. Its patterns dissolve into what comes next, forming the unseen foundation of urban life that would later define the region. In this sense, the Ubaid world was never truly lost. It was transformed, carried forward, and embedded within the civilizations that followed. And yet, transformation is not the same as understanding. The deeper we look, the more the Ubaid civilization appears as both familiar and unreachable, a reflection of early human society that feels close enough to recognize, yet distant enough to remain unknowable. In the end, it leaves us with a quiet but unsettling question. How many other early worlds shaped the foundations of history, only to fade into silence before they could ever tell their own story? Was this purely practical decision-making, or did the rivers themselves hold symbolic significance? In many early societies, water is not just resource but presence, something imbued with agency or meaning. The archaeological record does not answer this directly, but the placement of sites suggests a relationship that goes beyond convenience. As time progresses toward the later stages of the Ubaid horizon, subtle shifts begin to appear. Settlement sizes increase in some regions, while others show signs of contraction or relocation. Material culture evolves gradually, but not uniformly. These changes do not announce a collapse or transformation. Instead, they suggest a long period of transition in which older patterns persist alongside emerging complexities. It is within this gradual transformation that the boundary between the Ubaid world and what follows becomes difficult to define. The emergence of larger urban centers in later periods does not erase what came before. Instead, it builds upon it, incorporating earlier practices into a more expansive social framework. But which elements were inherited and which were replaced remains a subject of ongoing interpretation. In some archaeological layers, the continuity is almost seamless. A building tradition continues with only minor modification. A pottery style evolves slowly rather than abruptly changing. Even spatial organization within settlements retains echoes of earlier patterns. This continuity suggests that the Ubaid legacy did not disappear, but was absorbed into the foundations of later Mesopotamian development. Yet absorption is not the same as understanding. There is still no clear answer to what unified the Ubaid horizon so effectively across such a vast region. No central authority has been identified. No administrative system has been recovered. And without written records, the social mechanisms that maintained this coherence remain speculative at best. Was it shared ideology, passed through generations with extraordinary fidelity? Was it economic interdependence along river systems that naturally reinforced cultural similarity? Or was there something more intangible at work? Patterns of movement, ritual, and communication that left only indirect traces in the soil? Occasionally, researchers encounter features that resist integration into any dominant model. Unusual site layouts that do not conform to known settlement patterns. Isolated deposits that suggest activity outside typical domestic or ritual frameworks. These anomalies are rare, but they persist across different regions, hinting at diversity within what is often treated as a single cultural horizon. They do not overturn the broader picture, but they complicate it. And in archaeology, complications often matter more than confirmations. Because with each new discovery, the Ubaid world becomes less like a simple origin point and more like a layered process, an accumulation of practices, decisions, and adaptations stretching across millennia. It is a civilization that does not present itself as a narrative, but as a field of remnants, each one suggesting a life once lived but not fully recoverable. And so the investigation continues, moving between certainty and uncertainty, between what is known and what can only be inferred. Beneath the sediment of southern Mesopotamia, the traces remain, quiet, persistent, and unfinished. What kind of society builds such enduring patterns of life, leaves behind such consistent forms, and yet refuses to reveal the logic that held it all together? As the traces of the Ubaid world fade back into layered sediment and slow river memory, the narrative shifts once more, away from the floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia and into a vastly different landscape, one where water has long since retreated, and wind has become the primary architect of time. Out in the western reaches of the Sahara, in what is now the nation of Mauritania, the desert opens into something unexpected. Not a ruin in the traditional sense, not a collapsed city or buried temple, but a vast circular formation so large that it cannot be fully grasped from the ground. It is here that the Richat structure emerges from the sand, an immense series of concentric rings carved into the earth itself, stretching nearly 40 kilometers across. From above, it resembles an enormous eye staring upward through the desert floor, its layers of stone and sediment forming delicate bands of blue, gray, ochre, and white. The first impression is almost geometric in its precision. Perfect circles nested within circles, as if drawn with intention rather than formed by nature. For early observers from space, it became one of the most striking landmarks on the planet, a feature so visually structured that it seemed to challenge the assumption of randomness in geological formation. And yet, on the ground, the scale changes everything. The rings are not smooth lines but weathered ridges, rocky outcrops worn down by millions of years of erosion, valleys filled with sand and stone. The symmetry that appears so clear from above becomes more complex up close, less like a drawn symbol, and more like the exposed anatomy of deep geological time. Geologists now widely interpret the structure as the result of a natural process, a deeply eroded geological dome, once pushed upward by subterranean forces, later sculpted by wind and water over vast stretches of time. Layers of sedimentary rock, some more resistant than others, have worn away at different rates, producing the circular pattern we see today. There is no need, in this explanation, for human intervention. And yet, the human mind is rarely satisfied with geological certainty alone. Because the Richat structure does not merely exist as a formation, it exists as a question. In a region where survival has always depended on reading the land, its wells, its stones, its shifting sands, the presence of such a vast and ordered shape invites interpretation. Could something so visually deliberate have gone unnoticed by ancient observers? Or did it, at some point in human history, carry meaning now lost? Archaeological surveys in the surrounding Sahara region have revealed evidence of human presence stretching back thousands of years. Stone tools, ancient campsites, and traces of seasonal migration patterns suggest that this was not always an empty desert. Long before the dunes stabilized into their modern form, the Sahara experienced wetter climatic phases when grasslands and lakes supported roaming communities of early humans. In those distant periods, the Richat structure would not have appeared as a dry, lifeless ring system. It may have held water in seasonal basins. It may have supported vegetation along its inner depressions. It may have stood as a natural landmark within a more habitable landscape. But whether it was ever understood as something more than geology remains unknown. Mainstream archaeology finds no evidence of a lost city or organized civilization built upon or within the structure itself. No ruins, no inscriptions, no structural remains that would suggest urban development on a scale capable of producing the concentric geometry seen from space. The absence is as notable as the formation itself, and yet absence rarely settles curiosity. Over time, alternative interpretations have emerged, particularly in popular literature and speculative discourse. Some have suggested that the formation resembles descriptions of legendary cities lost to antiquity, places spoken of in myth but never confirmed in the archaeological record. Among these comparisons, one of the most frequently cited is the idea that it could correspond to an ancient, forgotten metropolis, its architecture so vast that only erosion now preserves its outline. However, geological analysis does not support this interpretation. The rock layers, mineral composition, and structural deformation all point toward natural processes occurring over hundreds of millions of years. The symmetry, while visually striking, is understood as the result of differential erosion acting upon a domed geological uplift rather than constructed design. Still, the question persists in quieter form. Why does something entirely natural appear so architecturally suggestive? Is it simply a cognitive bias, the human tendency to recognize patterns, even where none were intended? Or does the Earth itself sometimes produce forms that mimic the logic of design so closely that the distinction becomes psychologically unstable? Across the western edges of Arabia, along ancient routes that once connected distant cultures through trade and migration, there are scattered references, half-remembered traditions preserved in later texts and oral histories that speak of extraordinary constructions in lands now reduced to silence and sand. Among these, one name appears repeatedly in varying forms, a place associated with immense wealth, towering structures, and a civilization that seemed to vanish without leaving a continuous historical record. This is where the discussion drifts, carefully and cautiously, toward the idea of the ancient realm often associated in later traditions with the people of Iram of the Pillars. Unlike the geological certainty of the Richat structure, this subject exists in a different category of evidence entirely, one shaped not by stratigraphy or radiometric dating, but by fragmented textual references, interpretive translations, and centuries of storytelling. It is a landscape built as much from language as from land. In certain ancient narratives preserved in later religious and historical compilations, Iram is described as a city of extraordinary architecture, supported by monumental pillars and inhabited by a people of great power and prosperity. These accounts are sparse, symbolic, and often embedded within moral or philosophical frameworks rather than historical documentation. Yet they persist across time, echoed in commentary, interpretation, and speculation. Mainstream archaeology, however, approaches such accounts with caution. No definitive archaeological site has been identified that corresponds directly to such descriptions. No continuous urban settlement has been excavated that matches the scale or characteristics of the legendary depictions. Instead, what exists is a broader pattern of ancient trade networks, shifting oasis settlements, and lost caravan routes that once crossed the Arabian Peninsula and its surrounding deserts. These regions were not empty, far from it. Long before the rise of later empires, southern Arabia and the surrounding desert corridors supported complex societies engaged in incense trade, metallurgy, and long-distance commerce. Cities rose and fell along these routes, shaped by water availability, shifting climates, and economic cycles. Some of these settlements are well documented in inscriptions and archaeological layers. Others remain only partially understood, buried beneath sand or transformed beyond recognition. It is within this broader historical reality that the idea of a lost city becomes both more grounded and more elusive. Because cities in arid environments do not always disappear in the dramatic sense. They are often abandoned gradually, their structures eroded, their materials reused, their memory absorbed into later settlements. Over time, what was once a living urban center can become indistinguishable from the landscape around it. Walls collapse into dunes. Foundations are buried beneath shifting sediment, and without continuous occupation or written preservation, names fade faster than stone. Yet the persistence of Iram in later tradition suggests something more than simple disappearance. It suggests memory transformed into symbol. Some scholars interpret the references as reflections of real but generalized urban centers in antiquity, cities whose identities were merged, exaggerated, or reinterpreted over centuries of oral transmission. Others suggest that these narratives encode moral or cultural lessons, using the image of a lost and powerful city as a metaphor for impermanence and human fragility. And then there are interpretations that move further outward, into the realm of speculation, suggesting that somewhere beneath the shifting sands of Arabia, there may still exist undiscovered urban remains, not necessarily matching the grandeur of later descriptions, but perhaps preserving traces of early civilizations whose extent we have yet to fully map. Satellite surveys and remote sensing have, in fact, identified ancient caravan routes and buried structures in multiple regions, though none have confirmed a direct link to any singular legendary city. What makes this subject so compelling is not the certainty of discovery, but the tension between disappearance and possibility. Unlike the Richat structure, where geology provides a stable explanatory framework, here the challenge is interpretive. Human history is present, but incomplete. Texts exist, but are layered with meaning beyond literal description. Archaeological surveys continue, but the vastness of the desert makes certainty difficult to achieve. Every dune has the potential to conceal something, yet most reveal only the slow accumulation of wind and time. Across the immense sweep of human prehistory, from Mesopotamia's river plains to the deserts of Arabia and the Sahara, a recurring pattern emerges. Civilizations appear, flourish in unexpected forms, and then fade into silence, leaving behind fragments that resist complete understanding. This journey through ancient landscapes reveals not a single linear story of progress, but a complex web of cultural experiments, environmental adaptations, and symbolic systems that challenge modern assumptions about how early societies developed. In southern Mesopotamia, the Ubaid Civilization reveals one of the earliest examples of organized human settlement. Spanning thousands of years, it is marked by uniform pottery styles, structured villages, and repeated architectural forms such as temple platforms. Yet despite its apparent coherence, it left no written explanation of its beliefs or governance. Its consistency across vast distances suggests either strong cultural exchange or an early form of shared identity that operated without centralized authority. The absence of clear records leaves its internal logic partially hidden, raising questions about how such coordination was achieved in a pre-literate world. Far to the west, the Richat structure in the Sahara introduces a different kind of mystery, one shaped not by human hands, but by geological time. Its vast concentric rings, visible even from space, resemble deliberate design, yet scientific analysis identifies it as a naturally formed dome eroded over millions of years. Still, its striking geometry invites interpretation. In regions where survival depended on reading landscapes, such formations may have carried symbolic meaning for ancient peoples, even if no evidence of permanent settlement or construction exists there. The tension between natural formation and perceived design highlights how human perception often seeks intention within complexity. Moving from geology to tradition, the concept of Iram of the pillars represents a different category of mystery, one rooted in memory and oral history rather than physical remains. Described in later texts as a lost city of great wealth and monumental architecture, it has never been definitively identified archaeologically. However, the broader historical context of southern Arabia reveals real ancient societies engaged in trade, irrigation, and urban development along shifting caravan routes. Over time, cities in arid environments often disappeared gradually, their structures buried or reused, allowing memory and myth to merge. Iram may reflect either a distorted recollection of multiple settlements or a symbolic narrative about the impermanence of human achievement. In North America, Poverty Point demonstrates another unexpected expression of prehistoric complexity. Built during the late Archaic period, its massive earthworks and geometric ridges required enormous coordinated labor despite the absence of metal tools or permanent urban infrastructure. Likely serving as a seasonal gathering and trade center, it challenges assumptions that large-scale construction depends on centralized political systems or agriculture alone. Instead, it suggests that early social networks could achieve remarkable organization through cooperation and shared purpose, even in mobile or semi-sedentary societies. In the Andes, the Caral Soup civilization reveals a parallel development of complexity in a harsh coastal environment. With its monumental platform mounds, irrigation-based agriculture, and apparent lack of warfare structures, it presents an alternative model of early civilization. Its organization appears to have been shaped more by cooperation and resource interdependence than by conflict or centralized control. Yet without written records, its belief systems and social hierarchy remain uncertain, inferred only through architecture and spatial design. Finally, Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük in Anatolia disrupt traditional narratives about the origins of civilization itself. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-shaped pillars and symbolic carvings dating back to around 9600 BC, suggests that ritual organization and monument building may have preceded settled agriculture. Meanwhile, Çatalhöyük represents dense early urban life without streets or clear hierarchy, where domestic spaces and symbolic imagery were deeply intertwined. Together, they suggest that early human societies did not follow a single developmental path, but explored multiple forms of social and symbolic organization. Still, the idea of a lost city persists across cultures and centuries, not because of evidence alone, but because of a deeper cognitive pattern, the recognition that civilizations do not always leave clear exits. They fade, they relocate, they transform into something else before vanishing from record. In some surveyed regions of southern Arabia, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of fortified settlements, irrigation systems, and inscriptions that speak of kingdoms long dissolved. These findings demonstrate that advanced societies did exist, capable of organizing labor, managing water resources, and engaging in long-distance trade. But none align precisely with the legendary scale or imagery associated with later mythic descriptions. So the question shifts slightly. Not whether such a city existed exactly as described, but whether the idea of it preserves a distorted memory of multiple real places, compressed by time into a single symbolic location. Or perhaps something even more subtle, a narrative constructed not from one origin, but from many fragments of human experience, merged into a single archetype of rise and disappearance. The desert is particularly suited to this kind of historical ambiguity. It preserves nothing easily, but it also erases slowly. It allows traces to persist just long enough to be misinterpreted or reinterpreted by those who come later. A stone foundation can become a ruin can become a story, and a story, repeated across generations, can become geography in the mind long before it becomes verified in the ground. And yet, despite all caution, the idea refuses to disappear entirely, because somewhere between myth and archaeology lies a shared intuition that human settlements, no matter how advanced, are vulnerable to the same forces that shape all landscapes: climate, time, migration, and forgetting. Whether or not a singular lost city ever existed in the form later described, the conditions that produce such narratives certainly did. So the investigation continues, not toward confirmation, but toward understanding how memory itself becomes a form of archaeology, layered, distorted, and partially preserved. And as the desert wind moves across empty expanses where ancient roots once converged and separated, one question remains suspended in the silence. How many civilizations have vanished not only from the Earth, but from the way we remember the Earth itself? But even this explanation raises further questions. What sustained such large-scale cooperation across dispersed groups without centralized governance? What cultural or spiritual framework was strong enough to mobilize collective labor over such a long period of time? The layout of the site itself may offer clues, though not definitive answers. The concentric ridges could have functioned as spatial boundaries for different social or ceremonial activities. The central mounds may have served as focal points for gatherings or rituals. The bird-shaped mound, often referred to as a effigy mound, suggests symbolic or cosmological significance, potentially linked to celestial observation or mythological traditions. Was Poverty Point a place of pilgrimage, a seasonal convergence point where dispersed communities reaffirmed shared identity, or something even more complex, a hybrid space where trade, ritual, and social organization overlapped in ways that defy simple categorization? As excavation continues, another layer of mystery emerges, the absence of certain expected features. There is little evidence of agricultural infrastructure at the site itself. No clear irrigation systems or large-scale cultivation fields directly associated with the earthworks. This suggests that the people who built Poverty Point may have relied heavily on wild resources, fishing, hunting, and gathering, even while constructing one of the largest earthwork complexes in the ancient Americas. This combination, complex engineering without intensive agriculture, challenges traditional assumptions about the relationship between food production and societal complexity. It suggests that large-scale social coordination can emerge under different environmental and economic conditions than previously assumed. And yet, even as archaeology reconstructs plausible models, the deeper structure of meaning remains elusive. What did these earthworks represent to the people who built them? Were they cosmological maps, territorial markers, ritual landscapes aligned with celestial cycles? Or did they serve multiple overlapping functions that changed over time, adapting to shifting social and environmental conditions? Some researchers have noted possible astronomical alignments in the orientation of certain mounds and ridges. The suggestion is that Poverty Point may have incorporated observations of solar or lunar cycles into its design. However, interpretations remain cautious, as definitive proof of intentional astronomical planning is difficult to establish without written records. Still, the possibility invites reflection. If the site was aligned in part with celestial patterns, then its builders were engaging with a worldview that connected Earth, sky, and community in a unified system of meaning, one that has not survived in explicit form, but may be embedded in the structure itself. Beyond mainstream interpretations, there are more speculative ideas that occasionally surface in broader discussions of ancient earthworks. Some propose that Poverty Point reflects the influence of lost cultural traditions that once spanned large portions of prehistoric North America, now fragmented into isolated archaeological sites. Others suggest that its scale and coordination hint at social systems more complex than currently understood, perhaps involving periodic regional networks that left only indirect traces. These ideas remain outside academic consensus, but they persist in part because the site itself resists simple categorization. It is too large to be casual, too organized to be accidental, and too lacking in conventional markers of hierarchy to fit neatly into standard models of early urban development. What remains instead is a landscape that seems to exist in a transitional space,
between mobile and settled life, between small-scale social groups and large-scale coordination, between the ephemeral and the monumental. And perhaps this is where its true significance lies. Not in what it definitively was, but in what it suggests about the range of possibilities in human social development. Poverty Point demonstrates that monumental construction, long-distance trade, and complex planning did not require the later hallmarks of civilization as traditionally defined. It reveals a form of social complexity that operated through different mechanisms, less visible, less centralized, but no less capable of shaping the landscape on a vast scale. Still, even with all the evidence gathered, one central uncertainty remains. The site speaks clearly through its form, but silently through its intention. The people who built it left no written explanation, no guiding narrative, no direct account of what it meant to them. Only earth shaped into meaning, and meaning now obscured by time.
So the question lingers, as it does with so many ancient landscapes that resist easy interpretation. Was Poverty Point a reflection of a lost social order we are only beginning to understand, or a glimpse into entirely different ways of organizing human life that have no modern equivalent? And beneath the quiet geometry of its ridges, what other intentions might still be hidden, waiting for time and interpretation to reveal them? As the story moves forward from the earthen geometry of Poverty Point, the focus shifts once again, this time toward a different continent, a different climate, and a different kind of silence left behind by time. The narrative no longer rests on floodplains or deserts, but on a high-altitude plateau where air is thin, the landscape is stark, and stone appears to speak more clearly than soil ever could. Far across the Atlantic, in the Andean highlands of present-day Peru, the terrain rises into a world shaped by extremes. Steep valleys cut through rugged mountains, rivers carve deep channels through rock, and ancient winds move across high plains that seem suspended between earth and sky. In this demanding environment, one of the most complex prehistoric societies in the Americas took shape, long before the rise of empire, as it is commonly understood. Here, among the valleys surrounding Lake Titicaca and the broader Andean corridor, archaeologists trace the early development of the Caral Supe civilization, often associated with the Norte Chico region. Though not widely visible in the earlier narrative threads, its presence forms a critical turning point in understanding how large-scale societies can emerge in environments that seem, at first glance, almost inhospitable to sustained complexity. The most striking feature of this civilization is not what it built, but what it chose not to build. In contrast to many ancient societies that invested heavily in defensive structures or densely packed urban centers, the settlements of Caral Supe appear unusually open. Monumental platform mounds rise from the landscape, carefully constructed from stone and earth, yet there is little evidence of fortification. Residential structures are present, but they are arranged in a way that suggests spatial separation rather than crowded urban density. At sites such as Caral, pyramidal platforms dominate the horizon. Broad, stepped structures aligned with plazas and open ceremonial spaces suggest gatherings of significant scale. Yet surrounding them, there is no clear sign of the kind of warfare-driven architecture seen in later civilizations elsewhere in the world. No city walls, no military installations, no clear defensive perimeter. This absence has led researchers to reconsider assumptions about what drives early urban development. Was complexity always tied to conflict and competition, or could it emerge through different social mechanisms, ritual cohesion, trade specialization, or environmental adaptation? The archaeological record suggests that the Caral Supe people developed sophisticated systems of agriculture and resource management, despite the arid coastal environment. Irrigation techniques allowed cultivation of cotton, beans, squash, and other crops. Coastal resources, particularly fish and marine life, supplemented inland agricultural production, creating a dual resource economy that linked ocean and valley in a continuous exchange network. But even here, questions remain. The most enduring mystery is not the presence of monumental architecture, but the apparent absence of certain cultural markers commonly associated with early state formation. For instance, there is no clear evidence of written language. No codified system of record-keeping has been preserved in durable form. Communication appears to have relied heavily on non-written systems, possibly knotted chords, rhythmic oral traditions, or symbolic practices that have not survived in the archaeological record in a decipherable way. Without written records, the internal logic of this civilization remains partially obscured. We can see what they built, but not fully how they organized meaning. The pyramids themselves are particularly intriguing. Constructed in successive stages over long periods, they appear to have been periodically modified, expanded, or reburied beneath new layers of construction. This suggests not a static architectural project, but a living process, structures that evolved alongside the society that built them. What purpose did they serve? Mainstream interpretations describe them as ceremonial or administrative centers, places where social cohesion was reinforced through ritual gatherings and communal activity. Yet the scale of labor involved suggests coordination across large populations and extended timeframes. The effort required to construct these platforms implies a level of organization that, even without visible hierarchies in the archaeological record, must have been carefully maintained. And still, the absence of fortifications continues to stand out. In a world where many early societies developed defensive structures in response to conflict or competition, Corral Supe presents a different model, one where monumental construction seems oriented outward, toward communal gathering rather than inward, toward protection. This raises a quiet but persistent question. What kind of social conditions allow complexity to grow without visible signs of warfare or coercion? Some scholars propose that the economy of the region, based on the integration of coastal and inland resources, may have fostered interdependence rather than competition. In such a system, cooperation would not only be beneficial but necessary for survival. Fishing communities and agricultural settlements may have relied on each other in ways that reduced the incentive for conflict and encouraged periodic convergence at shared ceremonial centers. Others suggest that the apparent lack of conflict may be an artifact of preservation. Not all materials survive equally in archaeological contexts, and evidence of social tension or conflict can be subtle or erased over time. The absence of fortifications does not necessarily indicate the absence of conflict, only that it did not manifest in durable architectural form. Beyond these interpretations, there are broader questions about how such societies conceptualized space and time. The alignment of certain structures with astronomical events suggests that celestial observation may have played a role in organizing ceremonial life. The positioning of plazas and platforms may reflect not only social planning, but cosmological frameworks, linking human activity to cycles of the sun, moon, and stars. In this sense, architecture becomes more than construction. It becomes a form of communication with the environment, a way of embedding human presence within larger cosmic rhythms. Yet even as these interpretations accumulate, the civilization itself remains partially silent. There are no preserved narratives from its own voice, no inscriptions explaining the meaning of its structures, no direct accounts of leadership, belief systems, or historical events. Everything is inferred from material remains, stone, soil, and spatial arrangement. And inference, while powerful, always leaves room for uncertainty. Occasionally, researchers encounter features that complicate established models. Variations in construction techniques between sites, differences in spatial organization that suggest localized adaptation. subtle shifts in material usage that hint at changing social or environmental conditions over time. These details suggest that Caral Supe was not a uniform system, but a dynamic network of interacting communities. Was there a central authority coordinating these sites, or did they function more independently, linked through shared tradition and periodic interaction? The archaeological record does not yet provide a definitive answer. And so, as with so many ancient societies encountered in this exploration, the picture remains incomplete. What emerges instead is a civilization defined not by its certainty, but by its balance of presence and absence. Monumental structures exist, yet explanatory records do not. Social complexity is evident, yet its mechanisms remain partially hidden. Stability is implied, yet the processes that maintained it are not fully visible. Standing within the ruins today, one is confronted not with silence alone, but with a kind of structured absence, an organized world that once clearly functioned, yet left behind only partial instructions for understanding it. And as the wind moves across the high valleys, brushing over stone platforms that once held gatherings, rituals, and human presence, the question lingers in the thin mountain air. How many other early civilizations followed paths of development so different from our expectations that we have not yet learned how to recognize them fully?